Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. Every night, I hear music. At first, it was subtle, just a faint melody creeping through the walls. I thought it was from the neighbors, maybe an old radio left on or a TV that had been forgotten. But as days passed, it became clear. The music wasn't coming from anywhere. It filled the apartment, echoing in the emptiness of the rooms. Yet, I never left anything on. There was no source. I began to wonder if I was imagining it. My mind had been through a lot lately, stress from work, unresolved memories from a past I'd rather forget, but the music, it was too real. Too clear. Sometimes it would fade in and out, other times it would be louder, more persistent, like it was trying to get my attention. I couldn't ignore it. The first few nights, I searched the apartment. I checked the stereo, the TV, even the old speakers I hadn't used in months. Nothing. Just an empty apartment and silence once the sound stopped. But it came back. Every night. I thought maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but something about it felt wrong. The melody wasn't familiar, but it was comforting in a way. Almost like a lullaby. But then, a strange thought crept into my mind. What if it's not supposed to be comforting? The next time the music started, I decided to follow it. I stood in the middle of my living room, eyes darting from corner to corner. There was nothing but empty space. The walls were bare, save for a few pictures I put up to make the place feel like home. The floor creaked under my feet as I moved toward the door. I listened carefully, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It wasn't just one place. It moved. First, it came from the kitchen. I froze, my heart racing. No one was there. The kitchen light flickered briefly, making the shadows in the room stretch unnaturally across the walls. I stepped cautiously forward, but the music had already shifted. Now, it was coming from the hallway. I didn't want to go down there. The hallway was narrow, lit only by a dim bulb that always seemed to cast strange shadows. But the music, it was louder now. I could almost hear the notes trembling in the air. A soft, distant hum. I couldn't stop myself. As I walked, the floorboards groaned under each step. I felt eyes on me, though I knew no one was there. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every door I passed was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in, but I couldn't bring myself to look inside. Then, I heard it clearly. A voice. Not a human voice, but something else. Soft, low, barely a whisper. It was speaking my name. I turned quickly. There was nothing there. The hallway was empty. But the voice, it echoed in my mind. I stood still for a long moment, listening to the music that now seemed to vibrate in my bones. There was something undeniably wrong with it. I couldn't explain why, but I felt it. Something was changing, and I was the only one who could hear it. I needed to find the source. I retraced my steps, but as I reached the living room, the music was gone. Silence returned, cold and suffocating. My pulse slowed, but my thoughts raced. Was I losing my mind? Or was something truly there, something I couldn't see? I didn't sleep that night. The next night, I was more prepared, or at least, I thought I was. I hadn't been able to shake the feeling of unease from the day before. It clung to me, wrapping around me like an invisible force. The silence in the apartment felt oppressive, almost suffocating, as though the walls were closing in on me. I spent the evening cleaning, doing anything I could to distract myself. But it didn't help. The music was still there, lurking in the background of my thoughts. It was only when the clock struck midnight that I heard it again. At first, it was soft, like a gentle hum, almost like a lullaby being sung from a distant place. I tensed, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. It wasn't coming from the kitchen this time. No, it was louder, closer. My pulse quickened. It was coming from the living room. I didn't need to check the stereo this time. I knew it wouldn't be there. I had checked already, twice, and there had been nothing. It was as if the music existed in the air itself, a presence I couldn't touch, but one I could feel. I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand gripping the doorframe, my breath shallow. The music was now louder, clearer, as if it was filling the entire apartment. The strange thing was, it sounded almost familiar. The notes were repetitive, like an old song that had been twisted into something unrecognizable. A tune I thought I might have heard as a child, but now warped and foreign. Suddenly, the air shifted. The music was no longer the only sound. There was something else, something that made my stomach churn. It was a faint rustling sound, like dry leaves being brushed together. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was no breeze. No window was open. The sound was too close, too deliberate. I couldn't help it. I had to look. I walked slowly toward the living room, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Every part of me screamed to stop, to turn around and leave, but I ignored it. The music beckoned me forward, like a siren calling to its prey. As I entered the living room, the first thing I noticed was the temperature. It had dropped significantly. The air felt thick and cold, like I had stepped into an old, forgotten basement. I could see my breath in the dim light, a fog of white rising as I exhaled. It didn't make sense. The heater had been on earlier, and the windows were sealed tight. Then, I saw it. In the center of the room, a shadow stretched across the floor. It wasn't a shadow that should have been there. It was long, twisted, and seemed to move of its own accord. The music came from within it, as though it was emanating from the very darkness itself. I stopped, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The shadows seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the song, stretching and shifting as the notes danced in the air. For a moment, I thought I saw something that shouldn't have been there. It was a face, or at least, I thought it was. The outline of something grotesque, almost human, but with jagged edges and hollow eyes. I blinked, and it was gone. The music stopped, replaced by a cold silence that felt even worse. I could hear my heartbeat, the quick, frantic beats pounding in my ears. I backed away slowly, but my feet felt heavy, like the floor was holding me in place. There was no way I was imagining this. I turned and ran for the door. I didn't even care if I woke the neighbors. I had to get out. But as I reached for the handle, the music started again, louder than ever. It filled the room, the walls, the very air around me. And this time, I could hear something else beneath the melody. A whisper. It wasn't my name this time. It was a phrase. Come closer. I froze, my hand hovering over the door handle. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to go anywhere near the sound, the shadows, the thing in the corner of the room that I refused to acknowledge. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick with that thing, that presence. Then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The silence was deafening. The music was gone, the whisper was gone, the coldness was gone. I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind raced, trying to understand what had just happened. Was it all in my head? Was I going crazy? I had to know. I turned back toward the center of the room, the place where I had seen the shadow. But now, there was nothing. The floor was empty, just like it had been before. It was like it had never been there. But I knew it had. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, it was only just beginning. I didn't sleep at all that night. I couldn't. My mind was racing with questions that had no answers. The music, the shadow, the voice. It was all too real to be a dream, yet too strange to be a coincidence. Every part of me screamed that I was losing touch with reality, but I refused to believe it. I had to find an explanation, something logical, something I could hold on to. But the more I searched for answers, the more elusive they became. The next day, I called in sick to work. I needed time. Time to figure out what was going on in my apartment, and more importantly, what was happening to me. I tried to tell myself it was just stress. That maybe I had been overworking myself, letting my mind run wild. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The fear in my chest was too real. I spent the entire day going over the same places, the same corners, checking every nook and cranny as though I could catch whatever was haunting me. But all I found was the oppressive silence. Every time I entered the living room, the same chilling stillness greeted me. I would stand in the middle of the room, waiting, but the music never came. The shadows were still, unmoving. The apartment seemed empty, like nothing was wrong at all. By evening, I started to believe I had imagined it all. Maybe it had just been my mind playing tricks on me, a product of exhaustion. I tried to eat something, but my appetite had vanished. The weight of the silence pressed on me, making everything feel heavier. I tried to shake it off. I turned on the TV, played some music to fill the emptiness. But nothing worked. The silence was still there, lurking beneath the noise. It was like the apartment itself was waiting for something. I had just finished washing the dishes when I heard it again. The music. It wasn't the soft lullaby I had heard before. No, this was different. The melody was sharp, jarring, almost discordant. The notes clashed against each other in a way that made my teeth grind. It felt like someone was trying to drag me into the very sound, forcing me to listen to something I didn't want to hear. I rushed to the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. The music was so loud now, I felt like it was vibrating in my bones. But there was nothing there. The room was empty. I looked around frantically, searching for anything that could explain the noise. And then, I saw it. The shadow was back. It was darker than before, stretching across the floor like a liquid stain that refused to be wiped away. The music seemed to come from it, as though it was the source of the sound. It pulsed in time with the melody, its shape shifting, moving like it was alive. I could feel my pulse raise as I stepped closer, unwilling to take my eyes off the thing. I didn't want to be close to it. I didn't want to see it. But I had to. I had to understand what it was. The shadow flickered, like a light struggling to stay on, and for just a moment, I saw something that made my stomach turn. A face. It was blurry at first, like a smear on the wall, but then it became clearer. The face was twisted, contorted, its eyes wide and unblinking, staring directly at me. The skin was gray, stretched tight over the bones, like something dead, something not quite human. It didn't move its lips, but I could hear its voice. It wasn't the music anymore. It was speaking. "Why did you come?" it whispered. I froze. The voice wasn't in the air. It was in my head. It reverberated in my skull, deep and hollow. The words echoed, not just in the room, but in my thoughts, like they were part of me now. Like they had always been there. My body didn't respond. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on that horrible, twisted face. I felt a cold, creeping sensation in my limbs, like something was pulling me toward it, making me a part of it. I fought it. I didn't want to be part of it. I couldn't let it take me. But it didn't matter. The shadow moved. It slithered toward me, a dark liquid that flowed across the floor like ink spilled from a broken bottle. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The music reached a crescendo, a deafening wail that filled every inch of the room. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it stopped. The music. The shadow. The face. Everything vanished, leaving only silence. I collapsed to my knees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had never felt more alone, more afraid in my life. Was I losing my mind? Was this all just a product of my stress and fear? But I knew deep down that it wasn't. This was real. I had to leave. I had to get out of this apartment, away from whatever was haunting me. But as I reached for the door, the whisper returned, just faint enough to hear. "You're already here." I turned, but there was nothing. I didn't leave the apartment that night. Part of me wanted to run as far as I could from the nightmare that had unfolded in that living room. But my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Something was holding me here, something I couldn't understand. And now, with the voice still echoing in my head, "You're already here," I felt trapped. Like whatever was tormenting me had already taken root in my mind, and there was no escape. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. It was worse than the music, worse than the shadow. It was an absence, a void that pressed down on me from all sides. I could feel my mind unraveling, bit by bit, like an old sweater being slowly pulled apart. Every time I blinked, I expected to see the face again, or hear the voice whispering my name. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive stillness. I spent the next few hours pacing around the apartment, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe I was hallucinating. Maybe the stress had just broken me. But the thought didn't bring any comfort. Every shadow in the room seemed to move while I wasn't looking. Every creak of the floorboards felt like someone was following me. Then I remembered the old journal I had tucked away in my drawer. It had been years since I'd looked at it, but something told me now was the time. The journal had been my way of dealing with things long before this, whatever it was started happening. I thought maybe, just maybe, it might help me make sense of the madness. If anything, it might offer some grounding. I sat down at the small desk in the corner of my room, pulled the journal out, and flipped through its pages. Most of it was a mess of random thoughts, scribbled down over the years, memories of things I had tried to forget, dark thoughts I had never wanted to confront. But there was one entry that caught my eye. It was written in a shaky hand, as though the writer was struggling to keep control. The music is coming from the walls. It's not real, but it's here. I don't know where it comes from, but it's inside me now. It whispers things that I can't escape. I hear it in my dreams, in my waking hours. It never stops. I stared at the words, my heart hammering in my chest. The music is coming from the walls. I felt the blood drain from my face as I read those words again. This was no coincidence. I had heard the music. I had felt it move through the apartment, just like the entry described. I hear it in my dreams, in my waking hours. That was exactly how it had been. It had come from nowhere, and it was inside me now. It was following me, dragging me deeper into the madness. And then the final line hit me. It never stops. A cold chill ran down my spine. I didn't know who had written that entry, but I knew one thing for certain now. This wasn't just happening to me. Whatever had caused this, whatever had brought this thing into my life, had been here before. It had touched someone else. And now, it was touching me. I closed the journal and tossed it aside. I couldn't look at it anymore. I had to get out of this apartment. I had to escape, but where would I go? I stood up and walked toward the door again, heart racing. The hallway was dark, almost suffocating, the only light coming from the faint glow of the apartment's hallway light. As I reached for the handle, I heard it. The whisper. This time, it was louder. You can't leave. I spun around, but there was nothing. No shadow. No face. Just the empty hallway. I reached for the door handle again, but my hand shook as it touched the cold metal. I couldn't leave. I knew I couldn't. Something was stopping me. It was like an invisible force was holding me in place, a weight pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. I turned back into the living room. The shadow was there again, stretched long across the floor, its form shifting with the music that started up once more. The melody was different now. It wasn't just the eerie lullaby I had heard before. This time, the music was dissonant, jagged, almost painful to hear, like a piece of music that had been twisted and distorted. It was getting closer. The shadows seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the music, like it was alive. I could see the edges of its form, moving, writhing, like it was being pulled in all directions at once. The space between me and it felt like it was shrinking, the air thick with a pressure I couldn't explain. And then, I heard it again. A voice, this time unmistakable. Not inside my head, but coming from the shadow itself. You're mine now. The words were cold, final. And then, for the briefest moment, the shadows seemed to take form, an outline of something taller, darker, something wrong. Its face twisted into something I couldn't describe, its eyes gleaming in the dim light, just wide enough to see the horror that was reflected back at me. It reached toward me, the music now almost deafening, crashing in waves against my ears. The space between us disappeared in an instant. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy. The shadow was upon me, its presence suffocating. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The music, the voice, the face, all of it overwhelmed me. And then everything went black. I woke up with a start, my breath ragged and panicked. The room was cold, too cold, and I was lying on the floor, not in my bed. My head throbbed as if I'd been struck, and when I tried to move, a sharp pain shot through my body. My limbs felt numb, as though they had been asleep for hours, or maybe days. I forced myself to sit up, my vision blurry and disoriented. The last thing I remembered was the shadow, the crushing presence, the suffocating music, and then nothing. Where had it all gone? I scanned the room, half expecting to see it again, that dark, shapeless form moving across the floor, its eyes gleaming with malice. But there was nothing. The room was eerily silent. No music. No whispers. No shadow. I hesitated, then reached for my phone on the coffee table. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. I checked the time. It was past midnight. Had I really been unconscious for that long? The silence in the apartment felt wrong. Too still. I stood shakily, my legs wobbly, and moved toward the window, pulling aside the heavy curtains. The street outside was empty, bathed in the faint glow of streetlights. The city seemed normal, peaceful even. But inside, everything felt off. I felt like an outsider in my own skin. Like I didn't belong here anymore. I couldn't stay here. Not with the way my mind was unraveling, not with the strange things I had seen. But I didn't know where to go. Every part of me wanted to run, but the other part, the one that had been with me since the beginning, told me it was too late to leave. There was nowhere left to run. I turned back to face the apartment. The silence hung heavy in the air, almost as if it was waiting for something. A shift. A change. It was then that I noticed something different. The apartment was slightly off. The edges of the room seemed to blur, like the walls were breathing in and out. The shadows were sharper, longer, stretching toward me like dark fingers. I blinked, trying to shake off the dizziness, but it only got worse. The room felt smaller, closer, the walls pressing in on me from every direction. I could hear it again. The faintest hint of music. The melody was soft at first, almost like a lullaby. I turned around quickly, expecting to see the shadow again, but there was nothing. Just the same empty apartment. The same silence that had been suffocating me. But then I realized it wasn't coming from the speakers. The music was coming from within the walls. My heart slammed against my chest as I stepped back, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. The sound was clearer now, the notes sharper, more distinct. It was like it was living in the very structure of the apartment, vibrating through the plaster and wood. I could feel the music in my bones, in my chest. It was alive. It was pulling me in. The more I heard it, the harder it became to resist. I couldn't breathe. My head spun. Then it stopped. The silence came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the same oppressive stillness I had felt before. It was deeper, thicker, like something was waiting just beneath the surface, something that was ready to crawl out and consume me. And then I heard it. A whisper. You shouldn't have looked away. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The whisper came again, louder this time. You shouldn't have run. The voice wasn't just in my head anymore. It was in the room with me, surrounding me. I turned, but there was no one there. Just the walls. The same empty apartment. But it wasn't empty anymore. The shadow had returned. It was different this time, more solid, more defined. It was no longer a vague form stretching across the floor. It was rising, taking shape, like a figure made entirely of darkness, stretching toward me. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to escape. The figure seemed to smile, if it had a face at all. Its eyes gleamed, two cold pits of blackness that seemed to burn into me. "You can't escape me," the voice said, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command. The music swelled again, louder this time, crashing against my eardrums. It felt like the very air around me was vibrating with it. It was getting closer. The shadow's form began to stretch, the darkness pouring from it like liquid, flowing over the floor, moving toward me, wrapping around my legs. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The music was in my head, in my soul. It was tearing me apart. The shadow lunged at me, and I could feel its coldness wrap around me, pulling me into it, swallowing me whole. Everything went dark. Have you ever woken up to something on your phone that you know you didn't take? A photo, a message, something that wasn't there before, but now it is? What if that photo showed you something you didn't see? What if it showed someone else watching you, even when you thought you were alone? It was a quiet Saturday morning when it happened. I'd woken up late, the sunlight filtering softly through the blinds, casting long shadows across my room. The air felt still, almost too still, as if the world outside was holding its breath. I pulled my phone from the nightstand, rubbing sleep from my eyes as I unlocked it. No messages, no notifications. Just the usual jumble of apps and photos. But then, I noticed something. At the very top of my photo gallery, there was a new image. A photo I definitely didn't take. The image was simple at first glance, me, asleep in my bed, under the covers. The soft morning light hit my face just right, casting a peaceful glow. But there was something wrong. In the background, just behind the corner of my bedroom door, a figure stood. The figure was out of focus, blurred as if someone had taken the picture in a hurry, or worse, on purpose. The outline of a person was clear enough to make out the shape, but their features, if they even had any, were lost in the haze. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. Could it be a trick of the light? Or maybe some strange app one had accidentally installed? But my heart began to pound in my chest as I stared at the photo longer. I was certain I hadn't taken it. I hadn't moved, hadn't gotten out of bed. I opened the photo to get a closer look. The figure was still there, standing in the doorway. It was a blurry shape, but the more I stared at it, the more I could make out a faint outline of what seemed to be a face, or at least a vague suggestion of it. My pulse quickened. I tried to rationalize. Maybe someone had come into the room and taken the photo while I was asleep. But I lived alone. There was no one else here. No one else had access to my phone. I looked at the date the photo had been taken. The timestamp read just minutes ago. How was that possible? I had been in bed the entire time. My phone was on the nightstand, not in my hands. I could feel a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I wasn't sure what scared me more, the figure in the photo, or the fact that I hadn't even heard them move. My room was small, and if someone had come in, I should have woken up. But I hadn't. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling the whole situation became. My mind raced through possibilities, a glitch, a weird app, someone messing with me. But deep down, something told me that wasn't it. This felt wrong. I swiped through my photos, trying to find something normal to distract myself, but my thoughts kept returning to that figure. I even tried to take another picture, just to prove that my phone wasn't malfunctioning, but the moment I raised it to snap a shot, I felt it again. That sensation, like someone was watching me. It was faint at first, but I could almost hear the soft creaking of floorboards just outside my room. like someone was standing just out of view, waiting. I shook my head. No. This was insane. There was no one here. I was alone. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it intensified. I stood up, the weight of the air pressing down on me. My room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in. The silence was so thick, it almost felt suffocating. I walked over to my door and pulled it open, but when I looked down the hallway, there was nothing. Just the faint glow of sunlight coming through the windows. The house was empty. I turned back into the room, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched, and yet the sensation lingered. I glanced at my phone again, staring at the photo one more time. I zoomed in, trying to make out any details of the figure. It was then that I saw it, a reflection. In the mirror behind the bed, I could make out the vague shape of the person. But this time, their face was clearer. It wasn't just a blur. It was unmistakably human, though twisted in a way I couldn't explain. A face I didn't recognize, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly at me. I backed away, my heart racing. My phone slipped from my hand and landed with a soft thud on the carpet. The door behind me creaked again. Slowly, I turned, but no one was there. Just the hallway stretching out before me. Empty. My chest tightened, and the room suddenly felt much smaller. The walls seemed to be leaning in, the shadows darker, deeper. And then, I heard it. The sound of breathing. Soft. Heavy. Unmistakable. But it wasn't coming from anywhere near me. It was coming from inside the room. Behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I stood frozen. The air in the room had turned heavy, as if it were pressing in on me from all sides. The sound of breathing grew louder, deeper, as though someone was standing right behind me. I tried to steady my breath, to calm the storm of panic rising in my chest, but it was impossible. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the room. My mind screamed at me to leave, to escape, but my body refused to move. And then it happened. I felt it. The presence behind me. It wasn't just a noise. It was a feeling, a sensation like a cold hand brushing against my skin. Something was standing so close, I could feel its warmth, or lack of warmth, to be more exact. It was an empty, chilling presence, the kind that sinks into your bones and twists your stomach into knots. I spun around quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing. Just the usual furniture, my bed, the walls, and the shadowed corners of the room. But that feeling, it hadn't gone away. It lingered, pressing on me from all directions, as if the very air in the room was charged with something wrong. I glanced back at my phone, which was still lying on the carpet where I dropped it. My hands shook as I bent down to pick it up. I needed to understand. I needed to know what was happening. I opened the photo again, my eyes scanning it once more, desperate for answers. There was no mistake now. The figure in the doorway, fuzzy, indistinct before, was clearer than ever. But this time, I noticed something I hadn't before. The shape was moving. Not in any way that made sense. It wasn't like a normal person walking into a frame. It was more like it was fading in and out of existence, as if it didn't belong there. A flicker of something that shouldn't be, caught on camera by some force I couldn't comprehend. I zoomed in closer. It was standing there, in the doorway, looking directly at me. Its face, was barely there, just a twisted outline of features that didn't belong to anyone I knew. But there was something unsettling about it. Something familiar in the wrong way. It made my stomach churn, as though my brain was telling me I should recognize it, but I couldn't place where or when. And then, something moved. My pulse shot up, my breath catching in my throat. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no. The figure in the photo was gone. No, not gone. It was closer. I whirled around, expecting to see someone standing there in the room, but there was nothing. The room was still empty, my reflection in the mirror staring back at me. But that feeling, that sense of being watched, of being hunted, hadn't gone away. It was worse now, suffocating me, pressing on my chest. I slammed the phone down onto the bed. I had to leave. I had to get out of this room, out of this house, away from whatever this was. I pushed open the door, nearly stumbling into the hallway. My heart raced, each beat like a drum in my ears, but the hallway was just as empty as it had been a few moments ago. I felt a cold chill crawl up my spine, and suddenly the sound of footsteps filled the house, loud, slow, deliberate. But it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside my room. I spun back to face my bedroom, but the door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls. I staggered forward, trying to open it, but the handle wouldn't turn. It was locked from the inside. Panic surged within me. The footsteps were getting closer, each one louder than the last. I looked around the room, my eyes wide with fear. My gaze landed on the mirror again, the reflection of me, standing frozen in place. But there was something in the mirror, too. Something that shouldn't have been there. I could see my reflection, but behind me, there was another figure, standing just outside the frame. It wasn't clear at first, just a faint shape in the dim light, but the more I stared, the more I could make it out. It was the same figure from the photo. And it was smiling. My breath hitched. I could feel my legs shaking beneath me, my body begging to run, to escape. But my feet were glued to the floor. I couldn't look away from the mirror, couldn't break the connection with that thing behind me. I could see its face more clearly now, its mouth stretched wide in a grotesque grin, teeth sharp and uneven, eyes hollow like dark pits that stared right through me. It wasn't just looking at me, it was waiting for me. To do what? The question echoed in my mind, but I didn't have an answer. I didn't know how long I stood there, rooted in place, my heart racing in my chest, before the figure moved. It didn't walk. It slid across the floor, faster than I could blink. In one heartbeat, it was right behind me. I felt it again, the chill, the pressure, the weight of it standing so close. I didn't dare turn around. The mirror was my only lifeline to the outside world, and it was slipping away from me. Then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. I turned to face the room, but nothing was there. The door was still locked. My phone lay on the bed, the photo still open, and there was nothing else, except the sound of my breathing. The silence in the room was deafening. I stood there for what felt like hours, frozen, unable to move. My pulse thudded in my ears, and my legs felt weak, as if they might give way any second. The fear that had gripped me so tightly just moments before was now a heavy weight on my chest. I could hardly breathe, my mind a jumbled mess of questions and dread. What just happened? What was that thing in the mirror? Was it real? I stepped cautiously toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. It still wouldn't budge. The lock had been turned from the inside, and no matter how hard I twisted, it refused to give. I was trapped. Trapped in my own room. Trapped with the thing that had been stalking me. I pulled back, retreating toward the bed. The phone lay there, the screen still lit, showing the photo that had set all of this in motion. I needed to see it again. I needed answers, or at least some kind of explanation that made sense. I picked up the phone with shaking hands. The figure in the photo was still there, standing at the foot of my bed, just like before. Its form was clearer now, more defined, but the more I stared at it, the more I realized I had no idea what I was looking at. Its features were a blur, too faint to make out completely. But the feeling it evoked was anything but uncertain. That thing, it was real. And it had been watching me. I zoomed in again, focusing on the distorted figure in the background. The more I looked, the more I felt the unease creeping back into my skin. I couldn't understand it. How could a photo show something that wasn't there? And then, just as before, the figure began to shift. It wasn't like the way an image should behave. It wasn't static. No. The shadow began to stretch, to distort, as if the boundaries of reality itself were bending. The edges of the figure became even more ragged, the form contorting into something less human. I could feel my stomach churn as the shape slowly started to move, its outline flickering like a dying light bulb. Was it trying to get closer? My heart skipped a beat. Was it reaching out through the photo? Suddenly, there was a sound. A low, scraping noise, like something dragging across the floor. It was faint at first, but growing louder, closer. My eyes shot to the door again, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't coming from the hallway. The sound was coming from inside the room. It was as though the sound itself had materialized out of nowhere, coming from beneath the floorboards or from the walls themselves. My hands clenched the phone so hard my knuckles went white. There was no way I was imagining this. There was something in the room with me. Something real, something alive. The photo, the figure, the feeling, it was all connected. But why? I couldn't stop myself from glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see it there, standing behind me. But no! The room was still empty. It had to be. There was no way it could be real. I turned back to the photo, and my blood ran cold. The figure had moved. It was closer now. It wasn't just standing in the doorway anymore. It was almost beside me, creeping along the edge of the frame, its face. I couldn't look at it. I didn't want to look at it. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. The eyes, if they could be called eyes, were fixed on me now. I could feel them, cold and empty, boring into me through the screen. The smile, if you could even call it that, had stretched wider, revealing jagged teeth. Teeth that seemed too sharp, too out of place. But what terrified me the most wasn't just the face or the figure, it was the unmistakable sensation that I wasn't looking at a photo anymore. I was looking through a window into something else, something wrong. A soft, guttural laugh echoed from behind me. I spun around in terror, nearly stumbling, but the room was still empty. No shadow, no figure, nothing. Just the dim light from the window and the faint scent of something burned in the air. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. I needed to get out. I needed to escape. But I knew deep down that there was nowhere I could go. Whatever this thing was, it had followed me here. And now it was in my head, crawling its way deeper into my mind. The photo, it was still there. Still staring at me. I brought it up again, my fingers numb as I zoomed in, hoping that somehow I could make sense of what was happening. But the figure, no, it wasn't just the figure anymore. It was the room itself, bending, warping. The bed began to stretch out into darkness, the walls closing in. The window was no longer there. There was nothing but an endless void outside the frame. I wasn't sure if I was still looking at a photo or if I had crossed over into something else entirely. Something unnatural. And then, as my phone's screen flickered and dimmed, a message appeared. It was simple. Just one sentence. You're not alone. The phone dropped from my hand, clattering against the floor. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. I awoke with a sharp, painful breath, my body stiff from where I collapsed against the floor. My phone lay just out of reach, the screen dark. The message, the last thing I had seen before everything had gone black, still echoed in my mind. You're not alone. It felt real. Too real. As if those words weren't just a warning, but an invitation. A promise. I pushed myself up, my legs shaky. The room was unchanged. The bed, the desk, the clutter scattered around, everything was exactly where I had left it. And yet, something felt wrong. The air was heavier, like it was suffocating me, thick with the scent of something burnt, something wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My eyes went to the phone again, still lying on the floor where it had fallen. I had to see what had happened to it, to confirm that this was all just a mistake. Maybe I had passed out from the panic, maybe I had imagined the photo. But as I picked up the phone and turned it on, the sight that met me made my stomach twist in knots. The photo. It was still there. No, it wasn't just there, it had changed. The figure in the background had moved again, now standing at the foot of the bed, its face clearer, its features more distinct. I could see it better now, its eyes, wide and hollow, with nothing behind them. The skin, pale and stretched too tight over the bones, almost translucent. Its mouth was open in a wide grin, showing rows of sharp, uneven teeth. A smile that was too large to be human, too unnatural to be anything but terrifying. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It wasn't the figure, or its grotesque features, or the way it seemed to grow more tangible the longer I looked at it. No, it was something else. The figure's hand was reaching out. It wasn't just standing there anymore. It was reaching into the space of the photo, as though it were trying to push through the screen, toward me. The fingers were elongated, stretched impossibly long, and they curled in a motion that felt like a promise that whatever it was getting closer. I dropped the phone, the screen facing up, trembling as I backed away from it. The room around me felt like it was closing in. The walls seemed to be moving, breathing with some unseen force, and the air was thick, suffocating. I had to leave. I had to get out of here, but where could I go? There was nowhere that felt safe. Not anymore. My heart raced as I rushed toward the door again, only to freeze in place. I could hear it now, the faintest whispering, barely audible at first. It sounded like a voice, muffled, coming from the hallway. I pressed my ear against the door, trying to listen more closely. But the moment I did, the sound stopped. Complete silence, like it had never been there at all. I stepped back, the weight of the phone still pulling me toward it. The feeling in the room was oppressive now, like the darkness was pressing down on me, filling the space until I could hardly breathe. The whispering started again, this time louder, closer. It was unmistakable now. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, moving toward my door. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could almost feel the vibrations in the floorboards beneath my feet. The shadow outside the door had begun to stretch, creeping under the crack at the bottom. A shape was forming there, growing taller, darker. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking violently. I needed to get out of here. But just as my fingers brushed the cold metal, the whispers turned into a low, guttural growl. It was behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing made sense. There was no logical explanation for this. No way to explain the figure, the photo, the sound. Nothing in this room felt real anymore. The room, the house, it was changing. The walls weren't just moving, they were warping, bending in on themselves like the space itself had become something else entirely. I could see shadows flickering at the edges of the walls, stretching out like long, twisted fingers. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone again, trying to turn it on, but it was dead. No screen, no lights. Nothing. I slammed the back of the phone into the side of the bed, and that's when I heard it. A soft, mocking laugh. Not from the hallway, but from within the room itself. I turned, panic rising in my throat. The figure was in the room with me now. It was standing there, in the corner, just beyond the edge of the bed, its eyes locked on mine. Its twisted grin stretched wider, impossibly wide, until I thought its face might crack open. And then it spoke. Not in words, but in a low, bone-chilling hiss, like the sound of nails scraping across a chalkboard. You can't escape. You're already here. I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred, and the walls seemed to pulse in and out, like they were alive. I was suffocating. Trapped. I stumbled backward, my body hitting the floor. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence. It was everywhere now, suffocating me with its presence. The door still locked. The window sealed shut. There was nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. The figure began to move, slowly, its head tilting to the side, its smile growing wider, its eyes dark and endless. I had no choice. There was only one way left. I closed my eyes, and I waited. I don't know how much time passed after I closed my eyes. Seconds? Minutes? Hours? It felt like I was suspended in a state of numbness, as if the world had gone silent and I was floating somewhere between the real and the unreal. But the silence was only an illusion. I could still feel it. The oppressive weight in the air, the cold breath that seemed to be inching closer with every passing moment. I wanted to move, to escape, but my body refused to listen. My muscles locked up, paralyzed by fear. My mind screamed at me to open my eyes, to look, to run, but all I could do was lie there, waiting. I could hear it now, clearer than ever, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, just like before. But now, they weren't in the hallway. They were right beside me, as if the figure was standing just beyond my reach, watching. I forced my eyes open, barely able to focus through the blurring of my vision. The room was dark, but there was enough light seeping in from the cracks in the blinds to make out the shape of the figure. It was no longer just standing in the corner. Now, it was crouched beside the bed, its face close to mine, its hollow eyes staring down at me. I could feel its cold breath on my skin. I could smell something rancid, like decaying flesh, filling my nostrils, making me gag. Its smile, the smile that had once seemed so monstrous, was now stretched even wider, too wide for any human mouth. I could see the teeth, sharp and jagged, glinting in the dim light. It didn't speak, but I could hear its voice in my head, a whisper, like a memory I couldn't quite place. I told you, you can't escape. I recoiled, my heart pounding, but my body refused to move. My throat was dry, my lips cracked, and I could barely breathe. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but the sound was trapped inside me, caught in the thick, suffocating silence of the room. And then, I heard it again. The sound of my phone, buzzing from somewhere in the room. The same phone that had shown me the photo, the one that had started all of this. My eyes darted around, but I couldn't see it. It was too dark. The shadows in the room had become thicker, almost liquid, as if they were alive, moving, creeping closer. I felt my hand twitch. My fingers, it was like they had a mind of their own. They twitched again, then jerked toward the bedpost. Without thinking, I grabbed the edge of the bed, pulling myself up with whatever strength I could muster. My legs felt like jelly, my whole body shaking from fear and exhaustion, but I forced myself to stand. The buzzing continued. My phone, it was still there, somewhere. I took a step forward, my breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to find the phone, trying to end this madness. The floor creaked under my weight, echoing too loudly in the suffocating silence. The shadows seemed to stretch, reaching toward me with fingers like tendrils. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as if the very air around me was alive, breathing, waiting for me to make the wrong move. And then I saw it. The phone, lying in the center of the room. The screen cracked, the glass spiderwebbed across the surface. But it was still glowing, still alive. I crawled toward it, the shadows pulling at my feet, threatening to drag me back into the darkness. My fingers touched the screen, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move in the reflection. Just a flicker, a flash of something in the corner of my eye. I didn't dare look away. I pressed my thumb to the screen, unlocking it, my heart pounding in my chest. The photo was still there. It hadn't changed, but something else had. There was a new notification. A message. It's not over yet. The words were clear, sharp, burned into my mind as if they were written in blood. My fingers trembled as I read them again, and then it hit me, the realization that had been hiding at the back of my mind. The figure in the photo, it wasn't just in the background anymore. It had been watching me long before I even noticed it. It had been there, right in front of me, in plain sight, for longer than I could comprehend. It had been waiting for the right moment. It was still waiting. I turned back to the shadows, and that's when I saw it. The figure, no longer a distant specter, was standing right in front of me now, its eyes locked onto mine. It was no longer just a shadow. It was real. Flesh and bone. It reached out its hand, its fingers so long and twisted, like claws, brushing my cheek in a cold, sickening caress. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. I was trapped, suffocating under the weight of its presence. It leaned in closer, and for a moment, I thought I saw something shift behind it. A dark shape, something even more twisted, more ancient, moving in the background. The figure's smile widened, impossibly wide, as it whispered once more. "We've been waiting for you." The world spun. The room tilted. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The shadows, the figure, it was all blurring together into something I couldn't understand. My vision faded. My limbs grew heavy, and as I lost consciousness, I heard the sound of my phone buzzing once again. You're next. It started with a simple question that I couldn't shake off. How did this get here? I was sitting at my desk, flipping through my old, worn-out notebook. It wasn't something I used often, just a place to jot down thoughts, reminders, or random ideas when my mind felt too cluttered. But today, as I turned to a fresh page, I saw something that didn't belong. There, scrawled in my handwriting, were detailed notes about events I couldn't remember happening. They described incidents that seemed oddly specific, too real, yet impossible. The first one caught my attention immediately. It read, "Last night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The house was dark, but the footsteps weren't normal. They were slow and heavy, like someone was dragging their feet. I could hear them getting closer. The door creaked as it opened, but when I looked, no one was there. I swear I saw a shadow move across the floor." I blinked, confused. It was the kind of thing that seemed like a half-formed nightmare. But I didn't remember hearing any footsteps. I didn't remember waking up at all. I skimmed through the next few entries. Each one was more disturbing than the last. Tonight, I had the same dream again. But this time, I woke up in the middle of it. I was standing in the kitchen, looking out the window. The moon was too bright, almost blinding. I felt something in the corner of the room. I didn't dare turn around. But I knew it was watching me. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was there. I paused, trying to make sense of it. I had no memory of standing in the kitchen, no memory of that particular dream. Then, there was a third entry, and this one was the most unsettling of all. "Last night, I woke up in the middle of the night to see a figure standing at the foot of my bed. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was tall, too tall, and its eyes were just empty, dark pits. I don't know how long I lay there, but when I finally could move, it was gone." I felt a chill run down my spine as I read those words. I knew for sure that I hadn't written them. It was as though someone had been taking notes on my life while I slept, describing things I hadn't even realized had happened. And then it hit me. The strangest thing of all. The events described in the notebook weren't just random entries. They were beginning to happen. The footsteps in the hallway. I remembered hearing them last night. The shadow in the kitchen. I'd seen something in the corner of my just a few hours ago. And the figure at the foot of my bed, well, that happened last week. But how could I have written about it before it happened? I flipped the pages frantically, hoping for some sort of explanation, but the next entry only made it worse. "Tonight, I will wake up in the middle of the night. I'll hear the footsteps, and I will see the shadow. It will be different this time. The figure will be closer, closer than ever before." I froze. The next night. I hadn't written anything yet about tonight. I hadn't done anything except sit here, reading. But somehow, it felt as though it was already written, waiting for me to catch up. I turned the page, my hands trembling. The next entry was already there. "It's coming for you." I couldn't breathe. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and rushed to the door. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing. Was I going crazy? Or was something watching me? How did I know, so clearly, that the footsteps would come again tonight. I forced myself to calm down, to think. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That something, or someone, was just waiting for me to finally understand. And then, I heard it. A soft sound, just a whisper, at first. But it was there. I turned toward the door, my pulse racing, my breath shallow. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of footsteps. I slowly backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to move, to run, but my feet were rooted to the floor, my mind paralyzed with terror. The tap, tap, tap grew louder, closer. The door handle rattled as if someone was trying to get in. I couldn't breathe. My mind was screaming, but I couldn't move. I was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the silence felt unbearable, like the air itself had thickened. I stood there, frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. The rattling at the door handle had stopped too, but the feeling of being watched didn't. It was as though someone was still waiting on the other side, just out of sight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it knew I was listening, that it knew I was awake. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move. Slowly, cautiously, I stepped away from the door. My legs were like jelly, and my every step seemed too loud. I pressed my back to the wall, my eyes fixed on the door, expecting it to burst open at any second. But nothing happened. Tap, tap, tap. The sound started again, but this time it was different. The footsteps were inside the room. I turned sharply, my eyes darting across the room. It was still dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the floor. The air felt colder now, and the room seemed smaller somehow. The familiar walls, the furniture, the bed I had just been sleeping in, all of it felt wrong, like it didn't belong here. Like it was an illusion. I couldn't look away from the spot by the bed where the footsteps had been. Something was there. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't deny the pull of my own fear, dragging my gaze toward the corner of the room. I watched in terror as the shadow by the wall seemed to shift, moving on its own. It was as if it was trying to form into something that wasn't quite human. A dark, shapeless mass that flickered in and out of focus like a broken signal on a TV screen. Tap, tap, tap. The sound grew louder again. Closer. And then it stopped, just as suddenly as it had begun. My breath hitched in my throat, and I dared to take a step forward, my eyes never leaving the shadow. And then it happened. A figure appeared, tall, elongated, impossibly thin. I couldn't make out its features, only that it was there, standing right in front of me, blocking the door. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice was trapped in my throat, and my legs refused to move. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. I could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. It didn't feel like a person. It didn't feel like anything human. It was as though it was made of darkness itself, something ancient and wrong. The air around it was thick, heavy, like the room was closing in on me. I wanted to turn away, to run for the window, but my body betrayed me. I was rooted to the spot, staring at this thing, this shadow, as if it was pulling me in with some invisible force. And then, the whisper. It was soft at first, like a breath against my ear. But as it repeated, it became clearer. And with every word, my blood ran colder. You know me. The words froze me, holding me in place. I couldn't understand how I knew this voice, but I did. It was familiar. Too familiar. The voice sounded almost amused. But there was something more. Something darker beneath it. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My mind was in chaos, spinning with questions I couldn't answer. How could this be happening? Who was this thing? Who are you? I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. The shadow didn't respond right away. It simply stood there, watching me, its form shifting and swirling like smoke in the dark. I couldn't tear my eyes away, even though every instinct told me to run. Then it moved. It didn't walk or even step, it just shifted closer, as if it was flowing through the air, closing the distance between us in the blink of an eye. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribcage. It was too fast. Too wrong. My mind couldn't process it. And then I saw it. In the dark, in the flickering shadow, something glinted. A flash of light, sharp and sudden. A knife. The figure held it in its hand, thin fingers wrapping around the handle with unnatural ease. The blade gleamed in the low light, cold and silver. And as I looked, I saw the reflection of my own wide, terrified eyes staring back at me in the blade. I could see myself in it. For a moment, it was like I was outside my body, staring at the reflection of this figure holding the knife. But the reflection wasn't just mine. There was something else there. Something that didn't belong. The figure moved again, its hand reaching out, but this time it didn't come toward me. It reached past me, to the desk where my notebook lay open. The shadow's fingers touched the page where I had written the words. "It's coming for you." I gasped, realizing what had just happened. The figure, it was reading my thoughts, my written words, as though they were instructions. And worse, it was already a step ahead of me. It turned to face me, the blade still in its hand, its form twisting like smoke in the dim light. There was no face to see, no expression to read. Just the cold, inhuman presence pressing down on me. And then the whisper came again, this time louder, more forceful. "You're already in it." I stumbled back, my mind racing. Was I really living in some twisted, repeating nightmare? Was I writing the future? Could I stop what was happening, or had I already written my fate? The figure stepped forward, its fingers tightening around the blade. And in that moment, I knew. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't escape it. It was already inside my head. The blade gleamed in the dim light as the figure loomed in front of me. Its presence was suffocating, its movements deliberate and unnervingly smooth. I could see nothing but the shape of it, the outline of something wrong, something that should not exist. I was trapped, frozen, every muscle in my body refusing to obey me. I wanted to scream, to run, but the shadow's eyes, if you could call them eyes, stared through me, and I felt my legs buckle beneath me. I collapsed to the floor, my back hitting the cold wood, the sound of it reverberating in the silence. The creature didn't make a sound. It didn't need to. Its presence was louder than anything it could say. It reached out with that hand, the one still gripping the blade, and I flinched, squeezing my eyes shut. I couldn't look at it. The fear, the sheer terror was too much. But nothing happened. No blade slicing through the air, no cold steel pressing against my skin. I opened my eyes, expecting the worst. But instead, I found the shadow standing still, unmoving. It was just staring at me. Watching. I had to get out of here. I had to. My body, still shaking, obeyed me enough to crawl back toward the bed. The notebook. I had to get to the notebook. The idea that the answers, or at least some way out, might lie within those pages was the only thing that kept me from completely losing my mind. I reached up and grabbed the notebook from the desk, my fingers trembling as I flipped through the pages. My handwriting was there, every word familiar and strange at once. The same words that had been written in my sleep, words I had no memory of writing. But it wasn't the words themselves that terrified me, it was what they predicted. What they were starting to predict. The page I turned to now, the words were already written. It's coming for you. I read the sentence over and over again, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand. It wasn't just a warning. It was a prophecy. I hadn't written it consciously. I hadn't even known it was there. But now I understood. The figure, the shadow that had been in my room, wasn't just an entity of nightmares. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was something more. It was a part of this. It was already inside me, woven into the words, into the events. Each time I wrote, it came closer. Each time I wrote, it became more real. I glanced up at the figure, still standing at the foot of the bed, watching me with its empty, soulless gaze. It was like a puppet, a creation of my own making, but not one I had the power to control. It was becoming more real with every passing second, more alive. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was something I was writing into existence. I threw the notebook across the room, desperate to stop whatever chain of events I had set into motion. It hit the floor with a thud, but the shadow didn't move. It remained still, as if my panic didn't matter. As if it didn't care. I scrambled to my feet, my thoughts a blur. I had to make it stop. I had to erase it, erase everything before it was too late. I turned to the desk and grabbed a pen. I scribbled furiously on a blank page, writing whatever came to my mind, desperate for control. It's not real. The words were messy, frantic, but I wrote them anyway. I had to convince myself. I had to stop this from spiraling any further. But as soon as I wrote them, I felt it. The shift. The change in the air. The shadow moved. It was faster now, closing the distance between us in a blur. I couldn't think. My mind was racing, but the words kept coming, as if they were pulling me deeper into this nightmare. I dropped the pen, but it didn't matter. The figure was already too close, its form stretching and twisting in ways that made no sense. I couldn't breathe. The darkness around me thickened, and the shadow took shape. It was no longer just an absence of light, it was a twisted mockery of a human form. Thin, almost skeletal, with limbs that seemed to bend and curl unnaturally. Its face. I couldn't look at it, but I could feel it, watching me. It didn't need to speak. Its presence was enough. You wrote me here, it whispered again, its voice rasping like the sound of dry leaves being crushed underfoot. You called me. I stumbled back, my head spinning. This was my fault. I had brought it into existence. I had written it, and now I couldn't escape it. The words on the page were no longer mine. They were its. And as I looked at the notebook again, the page I had just written on changed. You can't stop what you've started. I gasped, my blood running cold as the words bled into my vision, shifting and warping before my eyes. It was becoming real. The lines between what I had written and what was happening were dissolving. The shadow tilted its head, and I could see something in its form, a glimmer of something human, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Something that resembled my own reflection. "I am you," it hissed. "And you are me." I stumbled backward, hitting the wall. The reality of what was happening hit me like a flood, and I knew I couldn't stop it. I was trapped in this cycle, this loop of words and shadows. Every time I wrote, I was pulling the strings tighter, drawing the figure closer. And the worst part? The worst part was that I didn't even know what was real anymore. The room felt smaller now. The walls seemed to close in on me as I pressed myself against them, my chest heaving with ragged breaths. The shadow, no, it stood just a few feet away, a grotesque mockery of humanity. The more I looked at it, the more distorted it became. Its limbs twitched unnaturally, bending at angles they shouldn't. Its face, once void of features, now twisted into a grotesque semblance of mine. It's not real, I thought, trying to ground myself. It's not real. It can't be. But as I said it, the room seemed to echo the words back at me, twisting them, making them feel hollow, as if the very air had been infected by the shadow's presence. "You can't escape," it said, and its voice scraped at my mind like nails on a chalkboard. "You are already inside this story." I didn't understand what that meant. Was it saying that everything I had written was leading to this moment? Or had it always been here, waiting for me to uncover it? My thoughts were a mess, but one thing was painfully clear: the line between what was real and what I had written was vanishing. The more I wrote, the more the world around me felt like it was slipping away. I had to stop writing. But how could I? The notebook was sitting there, taunting me. The pen, my only tool for control, was still in my hand. I could feel its weight, heavy with the promise of answers, or maybe more questions. The urge to write, to make sense of it, was overwhelming. But the moment I lifted the pen, the shadow stepped forward. Its head cocked to the side, a horrible smile spreading across its face. "What will you write now?" it whispered, voice dripping with mockery. "What lies will you tell to undo this?" I didn't know. I didn't have an answer. The words that I had written in my sleep had already shaped the events, and the more I tried to fight back, the more I realized that everything had been leading to this moment. I had no control. I wasn't in charge of this story anymore. "You are part of me now," the shadow said, its voice like a dead wind. "And I am part of you." I closed my eyes, squeezing them shut, trying to block out the horrible image of its face, but it didn't help. The darkness inside my head swirled, and the whispers grew louder. I had to stop. I had to fight it. I turned, looking for something, anything, that could help. But the room had changed. The walls were no longer the familiar confines of my bedroom. The corners were dark, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. The air felt thick, like I was trapped in a nightmare, and there was no escape. The notebook, my only connection to the world I once knew, was no longer on the desk. It was on the floor, open to a new page, as if it had turned by itself. And on that page, the words were already written in my own frantic scrawl. I cannot control what I've created. I recoiled as I read it. The words weren't mine, not in the way I knew them. They were just there. I had no memory of writing them. And worse, they felt like they were alive in a way that made the air feel colder. I turned the page, but the next set of words were just as chilling. "I am everywhere." I tossed the notebook aside, but it landed with a thud that made the entire room seem to tremble. The shadow didn't move, but I could feel its presence grow stronger, more oppressive. It was no longer just a figure standing still. It was like it was merging with the very air around me, becoming part of the space, part of the reality itself. I stood up slowly, trying to steady my breathing. Think. There had to be a way out of this. The more I focused, the more I realized I needed to do something, anything, to break the cycle. Then it hit me. The only way to stop it was to stop writing altogether. But the notebook had taken on a life of its own. Even when I wasn't touching it, it was there, mocking me with its presence. The shadow, too, was getting closer, its form distorting, becoming more fluid and less human. You think you can escape me? The voice, no longer just a whisper, boomed in my mind. I winced, clutching my head as the force of the words hit me like a physical blow. You can never escape the truth you've written. It wasn't just about the notebook anymore. It wasn't just about the words. It was about what the words were doing to me. They were unraveling my reality. I was losing myself, bit by bit, and the more I tried to resist, the stronger the pull became. I felt as though my body was turning into something else, like I was becoming the thing I had written into existence. I looked at the shadow again, and it was different now. Its face was a grotesque reflection of mine, but it wasn't just my face. It was contorted, stretched, like it was all the worst parts of me rolled into one. The face grinned, the eyes hollow and dead. I had to destroy the notebook. I had to destroy the source of it all. But as I reached for the pages again, I saw something else. The shadow was no longer just watching me. It was inside me. I screamed, the sound echoing through the empty room as the words bled from the notebook like ink spilling from an open wound. The room closed in around me, the walls pulsating, the shadows consuming everything. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. And then, in the deepest corner of my mind, I understood. It had always been this way. The notebook, the shadow, the words, I had created it all. And now, I was trapped in the story I had written. I could feel it. The change. The darkness wasn't just around me anymore, it was within me. I stood motionless, my hands still hovering above the notebook, paralyzed by the realization that I had written myself into this nightmare. Every line, every word, had become an inescapable trap. The shadow that once lurked at the edge of my vision now loomed in the center of my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts. How could I have let this happen? The air in the room was thick, oppressive, as if the very space had been rewritten to mirror the chaos inside my head. The shadows on the walls twisted unnaturally, stretching and twisting like tendrils that sought to suffocate me. I could hear them, they moving, whispering, urging me to finish what I had started. Their voices bled together, a cacophony of distorted echoes that made my teeth ache. "It's too late," the shadow whispered, its voice now an intrusive murmur inside my skull. "You can't undo what you've done." I shook my head, desperately trying to block it out, but it was too late. The notebook had taken on a life of its own, each page turning itself, as if to mock me for my futile attempts to fight back. My own handwriting was spilling out onto the paper, phrases I didn't remember writing. "It's not over. You're still part of me. You will never escape." Each phrase stung like a physical blow, the words burrowing deeper into my consciousness. The shadows seemed to grow stronger with every line, every new entry in the book. It was feeding on the fear that was rising within me. My own fear. I backed away from the desk, but the room itself seemed to shift. The walls, once familiar, now seemed to warp, bending and stretching. They were no longer just walls, they were part of the story. The air around me felt thick with the presence of the thing I had created. It was as if the whole world was bending under the weight of my own guilt, my own writing. I couldn't breathe. I reached for the door, my hands trembling as I turned the knob. But when I pulled it open, the hallway beyond wasn't what I expected. It was darker, longer. It stretched into infinity, the walls flickering in and out of existence, like the very fabric of the space was being torn apart. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. A cold chill ran down my spine. "You can't run," the shadow's voice echoed, this time from the darkness of the hallway. "You can't hide from what you've written. It's inside you now. You're part of the story, and the story is part of you." I turned, but there was no escape. The hallway was closing in on me, and the walls were beginning to bleed shadows, their edges alive with an unnatural, pulsing glow. My heart raced. Panic clawed at my throat, making it hard to breathe. The shadows weren't just shadows anymore. They had form. They were creatures, indistinct but undeniably real. Is this what I've become? I had to finish it. I had to finish the story. Maybe, if I could just rewrite it, if I could just change the ending, I could fix this. But the words came to me, my words, written by an invisible hand, all at once. The end is near. The room swirled with the words as they appeared in the air, hanging like a sickening reminder that there was no way out. The notebook, still on the desk, was a beacon of inevitability. I had to look at it again. I had to understand it. I stepped closer, each movement sluggish, as if I was wading through thick, viscous air. My hand hovered above the pages, but before I could touch it, I felt something cold wrap around my wrist, pulling me back. I spun around, but there was no one there. The cold tightened, squeezing the breath from my chest. The room was no longer just a space, it was alive. And the shadow was in it. In it. It had consumed everything. "You thought you could control it," the voice sneered, growing louder and more distorted. "But I am you. And you are me. The story has no end because it never had a beginning." I tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the thick, suffocating air. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The walls were closing in, pressing on me, warping and twisting as though the very room was fighting against me. The shadow grew, rising from the floor, its form no longer a mere reflection, but something that had taken on a life of its own. I can't. Suddenly, the pen was in my hand again. I didn't know how. I didn't know when. But it was there. And I could feel it calling to me, like a lifeline in the middle of the chaos. I had no choice but to write. The words spilled out before I could stop them, like they had a mind of their own. I am not afraid anymore. The moment the words left my hand, everything changed. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering, disintegrating. The room stopped moving. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, they were still. Silent. Still. I felt a strange sense of relief, a brief flicker of hope. But then, in the stillness, I saw it. The notebook. It was open to a new page, and on it, the words were already written. "You cannot escape. You are part of me now." The pen fell from my hand, clattering against the floor. My body went numb, as though the weight of everything had crushed me in that moment. And then, just as I thought it was over, the final line appeared, written in my own hand. "The story never ends." I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed. The world around me was quiet now, but I felt something watching, waiting. I never wrote another word after that night. The notebook is still there, unopened. I don't dare look at it again. I don't think I could. The story, whatever it is, still haunts me. And I am certain of one thing. It's not over. Not yet. I never thought much about doors. They're just things you open and close, right? You pass through them without giving it a second thought. But the door that appeared in my house wasn't like the others. This one was different. It wasn't there before. I could swear it wasn't. I know every inch of this place. I've lived here for years. And yet, there it was one morning, standing at the end of the hallway. A wooden door, simple in design, but undeniably out of place. No doorknob, no markings, nothing to indicate where it led. Just a dark, foreboding presence that seemed to absorb the light around it. At first, I thought it might be some kind of mistake. Maybe a door had been put in to fix an old closet or something. But no matter how closely I looked, I couldn't find any construction marks or signs that it had ever been there before. It was just there. I tried to ignore it. I convinced myself it was nothing. Just my imagination playing tricks on me. But every time I walked past it, I felt something cold and unsettling gnaw at the edges of my mind. It wasn't just the sight of the door that made me uneasy. It was the silence. The strange, empty silence that seemed to surround it. Nothing. No sound. No creaks of wood, no faint hum of the house settling. Just stillness. I didn't open it. I couldn't. But I couldn't stop thinking about it either. I'd walk past it, hurry by with my eyes averted, as if somehow, if I didn't acknowledge it, it might vanish. But it didn't. It stayed, watching me. And then, the whispers began. At first, they were so faint I thought it was the wind. A gentle rustle, almost imperceptible, like pages turning in an old book. But they didn't stop. I'd hear them as I passed by, soft and indistinct, like a conversation just out of reach. The more I tried to ignore them, the louder they seemed to get. Not alone, one voice whispered, just barely audible. "They know," said another, followed by a faint laugh. It was the laugh that unsettled me the most. It wasn't like any laugh I'd ever heard. It was hollow, empty. It felt like it was coming from behind the door, from something or someone that didn't belong here. One night, unable to sleep, I stood in front of it. My heart pounded as I stared at the handleless door, wondering what might lie beyond it. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I told myself to go back to bed, to forget about it. But curiosity gnawed at me, a terrible compulsion that made it impossible to look away. My hand reached for the door, my fingers hovering just inches from the frame. I was terrified, but I couldn't stop. I needed to know. What if it was nothing? What if I was just being paranoid? The air around me grew cold, a chill that seeped into my bones. The whispers grew louder now, clearer. I could almost make out the words. "Come closer." I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't my imagination. The door wasn't just there. It was waiting. Waiting for something. Waiting for me. With a surge of fear, I jerked my hand away, stumbling backward. The door felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just part of the house, it was part of something darker, something that didn't belong here. And whatever was on the other side, whatever it was waiting. The next few days were filled with unease. The whispers never stopped. They followed me through the house, like an invisible presence, never far behind. Sometimes, I would hear them from the door itself, as if they were coming from inside. I stopped going near it. I started avoiding the hallway altogether. The door became something I couldn't face, a looming threat that gnawed at my sanity every time I walked past it. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that it was there, watching me. I knew I couldn't leave it like this forever. I needed to know what was behind it. I couldn't escape it. The door. It was always there, just at the corner of my mind, no matter how hard I tried to push it away. My days had become a blur of avoidance, a constant effort to pretend it didn't exist. But the whispers, they never stopped. In fact, they seemed to be growing stronger. At night, they came to me in my dreams, soft and almost melodic, like a lullaby sung by a voice that wasn't quite human. The words twisted in my mind, muddled and garbled, but always carrying the same message: come to us. Open the door. The voice was pleading, but in a way that chilled me to the bone. It had been almost a week since the door first appeared, and I was no closer to understanding it. I had tried to tell myself that I was imagining things, that it was just a figment of my stressed mind. But the more I ignored it, the more powerful the feeling grew. The door was becoming something more, something that had a purpose. I knew what I had to do. That night, as the clock ticked past midnight, I found myself standing in front of it again. The hallway was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that presses down on you and makes it hard to breathe. I could feel the weight of the house around me, its creaks and groans as it settled into the night. But there was something more now, something suffocating. The door was alive in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I reached for the doorknob, my fingers trembling as they hovered just above it. It felt cold to the touch, like ice, but there was something else, a pulse. A faint, rhythmic thumping that seemed to echo in time with my own heartbeat. I had no idea what was on the other side. My rational mind screamed at me to stop, to turn away and forget about the door, to live the life I had before all of this madness began. But I couldn't. I couldn't live in fear of what might be behind it forever. With a shaky breath, I twisted the handle. The door creaked open slowly, the sound so loud in the quiet of the night that it made me jump. But when it opened, there was nothing there. Just darkness. A void that seemed to stretch on infinitely. It felt like I was looking into a place that had no end, a place that didn't belong to this world. The air around it felt thick, as if the darkness itself was alive, watching me. And then, I heard it. A low, guttural growl emanating from the depths of the dark. It wasn't a sound made by any creature I knew, but something much worse, something ancient and wrong. It reverberated through the floor, rattling the walls, shaking the very foundation of the house. I stepped back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The growl was followed by a sound like nails scraping against wood, slow, deliberate. The whispering began again, only this time it was different. It was closer, so close that I could feel it in my chest. "You've opened it," the voice crooned. "Now you must come inside." It wasn't asking. It was demanding. I wanted to slam the door shut, to block it out, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, paralyzed by something that was more than fear. It was an overwhelming sense of inevitability. The door was not something I could just walk away from. It had chosen me. Before I could stop myself, my feet moved forward. Slowly at first, then faster, as if the door was pulling me in. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last, as I crossed the threshold and entered the darkness. The air inside was cold, colder than anything I'd ever felt. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the sensation of being somewhere you weren't supposed to be. I felt my skin crawl, my body instinctively fighting against the urge to go further. But I couldn't stop. It was as if something was guiding me, pulling me deeper into the blackness. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. The walls, the floor, they were there, just out of reach. Like the space itself was shifting, alive with a mind of its own. The whispers grew louder, now unmistakable, their voices becoming clearer, more distinct. I could hear dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking at once, overlapping, until they became a single, unified voice. "You should not have come," it said, the words like a cold wind against my skin. "But now that you are here, there is no way out." I tried to scream, to call for help, but my voice was swallowed by the void. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My body was no longer my own. I was being dragged forward by something unseen, my legs moving as though they were on their own accord. I was lost, trapped in the dark. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating me. And then, I saw it. A faint light, barely perceptible, flickering at the far end of the room. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go toward it, but my feet moved of their own accord, taking me closer, step by step. As I drew nearer, the light grew brighter, revealing something in the center of the room. It was a shape, no, a figure. But it was unlike anything I had ever seen. A person, but not a person. Its skin was stretched too tight, its features contorted and wrong. The eyes, if you could call them eyes, were hollow, black as coal, staring straight into my soul. It opened its mouth, and I could hear the words in my mind before they left its lips. "You should never have opened the door." The door. The one I couldn't escape. I couldn't breathe. The air in that room was thick, heavier than anything I had ever felt before. The strange figure, if it could even be called that, stood still, its black, empty eyes fixed on me. Its body was unnaturally still, but the air around it seemed to ripple, like something was constantly shifting just beneath the surface. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I was paralyzed, stuck in place, as if the darkness itself had taken hold of me. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around and flee, but it was as if the room itself was closing in around me, pushing me toward the figure. "Why are you here?" it asked again, its voice not coming from its mouth, but directly in my mind. "Why did you open the door?" I wanted to scream, to shout that I hadn't meant to, that I was just curious, but no words came. The figure seemed to laugh, a sound that echoed through my skull, scraping against my brain like nails on glass. Curiosity. Always curiosity, it mused, its voice dripping with contempt. You wanted answers. Now, you will receive them. The light flickered once more, and for a brief moment, the figure's true form became clearer. Its skin wasn't human, its body was a grotesque amalgamation of shapes, its limbs too long, too thin, like a marionette that had been strung together by a mad puppeteer. The air around it rippled and warped, like it was distorting the very fabric of reality. I tried to move, to run, but the darkness had already taken hold of me. Every step I tried to take felt like I was wading through tar, my body heavy and sluggish. The whispers from the void grew louder, a chorus of voices now, all screaming, begging, pleading for something. But what? What did it want? You wanted to know, the figure said, its voice now becoming more insistent, but you weren't ready for the truth. No one is. Not until it's too late. Suddenly, the walls around me began to warp, stretching and twisting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The familiar shapes of the room, the corners, the edges, began to shift, melting like wax under heat. The floor tilted, and I felt myself stumbling, unable to keep my balance. You've seen the door, the figure continued, its voice now becoming something darker, something almost guttural, but there's no way back now. You can't unsee what you've seen. The light flickered again, this time blinding me with its intensity. For a moment, I thought I had been transported somewhere else, a different world, a different place. The shadows around me were no longer just shadows, they were alive, reaching out with tendrils that coiled and snapped at the air. The walls were closing in, and I could hear a steady thumping sound, like a heartbeat, growing louder with each passing second. You think this is just a door? The figure's laugh was a twisted melody, its voice echoing all around me. You've opened a gateway. A gateway to something much older, much darker than you can comprehend. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if something was pulling at my very soul, stretching it, tearing it apart. I gasped for air, but it was as if there was none left. The darkness was suffocating, and the whispers, oh, the whispers, were growing louder, turning into screams. Screams of agony, of terror, all merging into one terrifying cacophony. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard it. A door. A sound like a door creaking open, faint but unmistakable. The figure's eyes glowed with something almost like amusement, but it wasn't a comforting sight. The price of curiosity, it whispered, the words sinking deep into my mind like a poison. Is it worth it? I turned, driven by some primal instinct, my heart pounding in my ears. And there, in the distance, was a door just like the one I had opened earlier. But this one was different. This one wasn't in the room I was standing in. No, this one was far away, its edges flickering, fading in and out of existence. Without thinking, my body moved toward it as if it had been calling me. But with every step, the pain in my chest intensified, and the darkness seemed to grow more oppressive. It was as though the room itself was fighting against me, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't turn back. The closer I got to the door, the more the figure seemed to shrink, fading into the shadows. Its laugh echoed behind me, low and rumbling, like the sound of thunder far off in the distance. You can't escape, the figure called, its voice now distant, like the final echo of a nightmare. You will always be drawn to the door. It will always call you back. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I gripped the handle. But just before I turned it, a cold, hollow voice filled my mind. If you open this door, you will understand. But once you know, you can never go back. The truth will consume you. I didn't know if I was ready. I didn't know if anyone could ever be ready. But it didn't matter. The door was here, and there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, I twisted the handle. The door opened with a slow, grinding creak, the sound like fingernails scraping against a chalkboard. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, and I, too, hesitated. I should have run. I should have turned away. But something within me, a primal force, refused to back down. The door beckoned, pulling me forward. Beyond the door, there was nothing but darkness. It stretched out before me, endless and suffocating, as if the very air inside it was made of shadows thick enough to drown in. But there was also a feeling of weightlessness, a pull that was both familiar and alien at the same time. The room I stood in, the one I had just left, was no longer behind me. The hallway, the walls, the ground beneath me, all of it had vanished. I stepped forward, my foot falling into the void. And yet, I didn't fall. There was no ground beneath me, but I felt myself standing as though I was on solid earth. The air was cold, colder than before, and the silence, it was a silence that was almost tangible, pressing in on me from all sides, as if it were something that could suffocate. The door behind me slammed shut with a deafening crash, and the darkness around me seemed to thicken. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was no escape. The door was gone, and I was alone. No, not alone. There was something here, something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't a figure or a person, but an overwhelming presence, a pressure that I could feel in my bones. Something was watching me, something that wanted me to know it was there. I took another step, my body moving despite my fear, the chill in the air biting at my skin. The darkness seemed to shift with me, pulsing like it had a life of its own. And then I heard it. A whisper. It started soft, barely a murmur, but it grew louder with every passing second, like 1,000 voices calling out to me from the depths of the darkness. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt them. They were speaking to me, speaking through me, the sound vibrating deep in my chest. You opened the door, the voices whispered, their tone both mocking and mournful. Now you must face the truth. The walls, or what I thought were walls, began to shift, too. They warped, bending and twisting in ways that shouldn't have been possible, like the air itself was bending around me. The void stretched, revealing images, flashes of memories I didn't recognize, as if the room was becoming a mirror to my mind. I saw myself, but not as I was. The version of me in the reflection was different, pale, gaunt, eyes wide with terror. This version of me reached out, as if trying to warn me, but the image dissolved as quickly as it appeared, leaving me staring into the blackness once again. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. What is this? I whispered, my voice cracking in the void. You wanted the truth, the voices echoed, growing louder, overlapping. Now you will know. Suddenly, the darkness began to pull away. The air shifted, as if some great curtain was being drawn aside. And before me, like a broken memory, there was something real. It was a room. A small, empty room, bathed in a dim, flickering light. The walls were covered in strange, cryptic symbols, symbols that seemed to move as I stared at them, writhing like insects beneath the surface. The floor was cracked, worn with age, but there was no ceiling. Just sky. I stepped into the room, my breath shallow, and as I did, the whispers quieted, leaving only the soft hum of an unsettling silence. In the center of the room, there was a chair. An old, wooden chair, the kind that looked as if it belonged in a forgotten house, untouched for years. And in that chair, there was something else. A figure. It was hunched over, its head resting against the armrest, as if it had been waiting for me. I couldn't see its face at first. But as I stepped closer, the figure stirred, slowly lifting its head, and I froze. The face, if you could call it a face, was a patchwork of flesh and bone, as if it had been stitched together from fragments of different people. The eyes were hollow, black and empty, but they stared directly at me. I could feel them burrowing into my soul, as if they could see everything I had ever done, everything I had ever been. You shouldn't have come, the figure rasped, its voice deep, like the sound of gravel being dragged across stone. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But I couldn't move. My feet were cemented to the ground, my body locked in place by some unseen force. You opened the door, the figure continued, its voice barely a whisper now, but somehow louder than ever. And now you belong here, with us. The world around me seemed to warp again. The room, the chair, the figure, everything began to crumble, fading into nothing. I could hear the sound of shuffling footsteps, close behind me, the whispers swelling into a deafening roar. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I was standing in the same hallway where I had first opened the door. The familiar surroundings were the same, yet nothing felt right. The walls were cracked, the floorboards uneven. The house, once comforting, now seemed like a prison. I turned around, expecting to see the door. But it was gone. There was no sign of it, no trace of the place I had just been. I could feel it now. The presence. The weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating me. You opened the door, the voice whispered again, this time inside my head, so close it felt like it was part of me. And now, you were one of us. I woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hands trembled as they gripped the edges of the bed. I wasn't sure if I had been dreaming or if I was still in that horrible place, the one beyond the door. But the feeling, the presence, it lingered. It was real. For a moment, I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together what had happened. Had it been a dream? No. The sensations, the smells, the weight in the air, those weren't dreams. I could still feel them, could still taste the fear in the back of my throat. The voice. The whispers. But it was gone now, wasn't it? The room was just as it should be. The hum of the fridge in the other room, the creak of the floorboards beneath me, the distant sound of cars outside, everything was normal. I slowly sat up, my head spinning. The room felt strangely cold, but I couldn't tell if it was from the nightmare or from something else. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake the sleep from my body. And that's when I noticed it. The door. The door that had never been there before was now standing across the room, quietly waiting. I couldn't breathe. My body stiffened, every nerve on edge. I had thought I had left it behind. But there it was, that same door I had opened, the one that led to whatever that place had been. It was impossible. There was no way it could be here. Yet there it stood, its wood dark and scratched, as if it had aged years in a matter of hours. My legs refused to move, but my curiosity, that damn curiosity, pulled me closer. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to know what lay beyond, but I had no choice. I had already opened the door once, and now it was calling me again. I had to answer. I stood up shakily, my breath shallow, and walked toward the door. With every step, my heart beat louder in my chest, as if it could sense the danger. I reached out to touch the handle, and just as my fingers brushed against it, the sound of a soft knock came from the other side. The knock was gentle, almost polite. But it didn't belong. It didn't belong here. Not in my house. Not in this world. I jerked my hand away from the handle, staring at it as if it had burned me. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to leave, to forget everything. But the door was there. It was waiting. And somehow, I knew that if I didn't open it, it would haunt me forever. The knocking came again, this time louder. Knock. Knock, knock, 3 times. Each one felt like a hammer pounding against my skull. I took a deep breath, reached for the handle, and twisted it. The door opened with a deep groan, and I stepped through. But this time, it wasn't the same. The room was no longer dark and oppressive. Instead, it was blindingly bright, almost too bright to bear. My eyes stung as I blinked, trying to adjust to the intense light. I tried to take a step forward, but something stopped me, something invisible, like a wall I couldn't see. I reached out to touch it, but the air seemed to resist me, pushing me back with a force that made my chest tighten. The whispers returned, soft at first, then louder, until they were a deafening chorus in my mind. I couldn't make out the words, but the feeling was clear. I was not meant to be here. The world around me began to shift, stretching and warping like it had before. The floor beneath my feet wavered, and the walls seemed to pulse, breathing with a rhythm that wasn't my own. The bright light began to flicker, casting strange, twisted shadows that moved with unnatural fluidity. Then I heard it. A voice. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was loud, clear, and direct. "You've opened the door again." I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. The room, this place, whatever it was empty. Except for the door. The same door that had brought me here. The voice came again, "You cannot leave." Not this time. I tried to run. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and with every step, the air grew thicker, the pressure building until it felt like I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, and I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. "You opened the door," the voice repeated, "and now you are one of us." I stumbled, my hands reaching out for something, anything, to hold on to. But the room was shifting again. It was no longer a room at all. The walls dissolved into nothingness, and the floor gave way beneath my feet. I fell through the darkness, falling deeper and deeper into a pit that seemed to stretch on forever. The whispers, the voices, the presence, it all surrounded me, suffocating me as I plummeted into the void. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The whispers died. The falling stopped. The pressure lifted. I opened my eyes. I was standing in front of my house. Everything looked normal. The yard, the trees, the mailbox. It was all the same. But the air felt different, thicker, as if it was heavier somehow. I stepped forward, my feet dragging, as if the weight of the world had settled on my shoulders. The door to my house was open, but there was something wrong. Something wasn't right. The air was still. I walked up the steps, the familiar creak of the wooden boards beneath my feet feeling strange, like I was walking in someone else's body. When I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. The house was empty. Empty, except for the smell. A strange, sickly sweet odor filled the air, and my eyes were drawn to the corner of the room. There, sitting on the floor, was a broken piece of something shiny. Something familiar. It was the shattered remains of the same ring I had thrown away weeks ago. The same ring I had dropped in the woods. And in the reflection of the glass, I saw it. A figure. Behind me. Watching. Have you ever felt like you're being watched, but when you turn around, no one's there? I had. And it didn't stop there. It started a few months ago, after I moved into the old house on the outskirts of town. I hadn't planned on installing security cameras, but my growing sense of unease pushed me to do it. The house was too quiet, too secluded, and the more I stayed there alone, the more something felt off. It wasn't just the creaks in the night or the whisper of wind brushing against the windows. It was the constant feeling of being observed, even when there was no one around. I set up cameras throughout the house, just in case. Just to be sure. It was a typical Thursday when I first noticed something strange. I had been working late, and once the darkness settled in, I decided to review the footage from the security cameras. A routine check, nothing special. The footage from the living room played on the screen in front of me, and everything looked as it should. The clock on the wall, the empty chairs, the familiar stillness of the room. But then, at the very edge of the frame, something moved. A shadow. A dark figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a glitch in the system. But as I rewound the footage, the figure didn't disappear. It stood there in the hallway, perfectly still, almost as if it was waiting for something. For me. I leaned forward, my eyes fixed on the screen. The figure wasn't clear, too dark, too vague, but there was something wrong about it. It wasn't shaped like a person, yet it had a presence. It didn't seem to belong in the room, in the house, in this world. I tried to convince myself that it was just a mistake. A shadow cast by something in the room, or maybe a bug flying across the lens. I ran the footage again, but this time I focused on the hallway, the space where the figure had appeared. Nothing. I shook my head. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I closed the laptop and went to bed, trying to put the thought out of my mind. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The feeling of being watched, that gnawing sensation at the back of my mind, was worse than ever. I kept hearing things, soft whispers, like someone was calling my name. But every time I opened my eyes, there was nothing. Just the dark, empty corners of my room. The next morning, I told myself I was being ridiculous. I had to focus. I had to be rational. So, I checked the footage again. I knew I would. I couldn't help myself. This time, the figure was more distinct. It wasn't just standing there anymore. It was moving. Slowly, deliberately, it crossed the hallway, disappearing into the kitchen. I watched it on the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. It was tall, too tall. Its movements were unnaturally smooth, gliding across the floor like it wasn't even touching the ground. And the worst part? I never heard a sound. No footsteps. No creaks. Nothing. Just a dark, shapeless form that slipped through my house unnoticed by the human eye. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to look away. I watched the footage for what felt like hours, rewinding and fast-forwarding, trying to find an explanation. But no matter how many times I looked, it didn't make sense. The figure didn't belong. I couldn't help but feel that it was aware of me. That somehow, it was waiting for me to see it, to acknowledge it. And then it happened. I got up. I walked toward the hallway. I needed to prove myself wrong. I needed to confront whatever it was, face to face. But when I turned the corner into the hallway, it was gone. The house was silent. Nothing was out of place. Yet the air felt heavier, like something was pressing in from all sides. I stood there, feeling a sudden wave of dread wash over me. The normal sounds of the house, the hum of the fridge, the ticking of the clock, seemed distant, almost drowned out by a low, unrelenting hum that I couldn't place. I stood there, waiting. And then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, a rustling, like fabric brushing against skin. I turned sharply, but there was nothing. Nothing but the empty hallway. But I knew something was there. I felt it. And then the door to the basement creaked open. I stood frozen at the end of the hallway, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The basement door, which I was sure had been firmly closed just moments ago, was now slightly ajar. A thin sliver of darkness peeked through the crack, like an invitation or a warning. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to convince me that there was some logical explanation. Maybe the door wasn't closed all the way. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. This wasn't a natural occurrence. Not anymore. I turned back to the hallway, looking for any sign of the dark figure, but it was gone. It was as if it had never been there. I walked toward the basement door, each step slow, deliberate, as if I could somehow stop whatever was about to happen by sheer force of will. The air grew colder the closer I got to the door. A chill that seemed to sink into my bones, making my hands tremble. The basement was always a place I avoided. It was small, cramped, with low ceilings and concrete walls that seemed to absorb all light. The kind of place where things felt wrong, even in the daytime. But now, standing before it in the quiet of the night, it felt like something was waiting for me inside. I reached out and gripped the cold handle, my fingers barely able to hold on. It was as if the door itself was trying to pull me in. A sudden gust of wind from somewhere deep in the house made the door creak in protest, as though urging me to turn away. But I couldn't. I was drawn to it, like a moth to a flame. I pulled the door open just enough to peek inside, but there was nothing. Just darkness. The same impenetrable darkness that had always been there. But something was different this time. Something off. A faint whisper, like a sigh, seemed to drift up from the basement, almost too soft to hear, but clear enough that I couldn't ignore it. I stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under my weight as I descended the stairs. The basement smelled musty, like old wood and dust, but beneath it was something else, a scent I couldn't place. A sickly, sweet odor that clung to the air and made my stomach churn. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong here. That something, where someone, was waiting. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. The basement stretched out before me, full of old boxes and forgotten furniture. The kind of clutter you only find in a place left untouched for years. But there was something else. In the far corner, near the furnace, I saw it. A dark shape. Not the figure I had seen on the cameras, but something else. Something more. It was crouched in the corner, barely visible, its form shifting and rippling in the low light. It was as if it was made of the shadows themselves, constantly changing shape, never quite still. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place by an overwhelming sense of terror. The shape didn't seem to notice me at first. It was like it was waiting for something, or someone. But as I stood there, helpless, I felt it. Its presence. Its awareness. It knew I was there. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. The air grew thicker, like I was breathing through water, and my heart pounded in my chest. My thoughts scattered, but one thing was clear: I had to leave. Now. I turned to run, but the moment I did, the shape moved. It was fast, too fast. I heard a rustling sound, like something scraping against the concrete floor, and then the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps that followed me, no matter how quickly I tried to escape. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran up the stairs, my breath ragged, and slammed the basement door shut behind me, my hands shaking as I locked it. The house was silent again, but the silence felt wrong. It was thick, suffocating. I stood in the hallway, panting, trying to calm my racing heart. I knew I had to leave. I had to get out of the house. But as I looked around, something caught my eye. The cameras. The ones I had set up around the house. I ran to my laptop, fingers trembling as I opened the footage. My eyes flicked to the hallway camera first. The footage was live, showing nothing but the empty corridor. But then I rewound it. And there it was. The figure, standing at the far end of the hallway, right where I had just been. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, just beyond the reach of the camera's lens, something else was moving. Something larger. Darker. The figure turned, its head swiveling slowly, as if it had noticed the camera. And then, with unnatural speed, it vanished into the darkness. I didn't wait to see more. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my voice barely a whisper as I told them everything. But when they arrived, they found nothing. The house was empty, as it had always been. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of anything out of the ordinary. The only thing they took with them was the footage from my camera. They didn't believe me. And neither do I, sometimes. But that feeling, the one that crawls under your skin, the one that says you're being watched, it never goes away. Not anymore. I spent the next few days in a fog, trying to piece together what had happened. The house felt different now. I had lived here for years without a problem, but after that night, everything had changed. The air seemed thicker, as though something unseen was hanging around, waiting, watching. The police had left, and they hadn't found a thing. No strange footprints, no unusual disturbances, nothing that could explain the things I'd seen or felt. They'd taken the footage from the cameras as evidence, and after reviewing it, they told me the same thing they always said in these situations: there was nothing there. It was just a glitch, a trick of the light, my mind playing tricks on me. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. I didn't sleep much after that. The shadows in the house seemed to stretch longer, the sounds more pronounced. The creaking of the floorboards, the whispers in the wind, the way the light flickered in the hallways, they were all magnified, distorted by my fear. But I couldn't stop myself from returning to the cameras, couldn't stop myself from watching the footage again, even though I knew it would only make things worse. It was around midnight when I sat down at my desk and pulled up the footage again. The screens flickered to life, casting an eerie glow over the room. I focused on the hallway camera first, the one that had captured the figure. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. At first, the footage seemed normal, just the empty hallway, the faint shadows cast by the dim lights. But then I saw it. At the very edge of the frame, a movement. It was so subtle that I almost missed it. A figure, darker than the shadows around it. No clear shape, just an outline that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just standing there like before. It was moving, slowly, almost as if it was testing the limits of the camera's vision. I leaned in closer to the screen, my eyes straining to catch every detail. The figure didn't move like a person. It seemed to ripple, like smoke curling on itself. It would stretch and then contract, the shape distorting, always just out of focus. Then it did something I wasn't expecting. It turned. Not just its head, but the entire body. Slowly, deliberately. Its gaze, if it could even be called that, shifted toward the camera, toward me. I could feel it, the weight of its presence pressing against me from the screen. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees, the cold sinking into my skin, making my hands tremble. I couldn't look away. It was as if something in me knew I had to keep watching. But a small part of me, the rational part, screamed for me to shut it down, to turn off the camera and walk away. But I didn't. I saw the figure step closer to the camera. Its movements were unnatural, like a puppet with broken strings, jerky and unpredictable. And just as it came into full view of the lens, it disappeared. 1 second, it was there, and the next, it was gone. But that wasn't the worst part. What terrified me even more was what I saw next. In the very next frame, the figure appeared again. But this time, it wasn't in the hallway. It was standing just outside my bedroom door. I could see the dark shape outlined against the faint light coming from the crack beneath the door. My blood ran cold. I didn't remember hearing anything. No footsteps, no creaking of the door, nothing. But there it was, clear as day. The figure, standing motionless, watching. I jumped up from my chair, heart racing. The footage continued to play, and I watched in horror as the figure remained there, unmoving, for what felt like an eternity. It was as if it was waiting for me to do something, to move, to react. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished again. I sat there, my mind racing. What was happening? How could this be real? I grabbed my phone and called my friend, Mark. He was one of the few people I could trust with this. He'd always been the skeptical one, the one who dismissed anything strange as coincidence or imagination. But after everything I had seen, I needed someone to hear me out. I needed someone to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. "Hey, Mark, I started, but my voice trailed off. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain this? How could I make him understand that there was something in my house, something that wasn't supposed to be there? Calm down, man. What's going on?" he asked, his voice steady, but I could hear the concern behind it. I think something is in my house. I've been seeing things, figures, shadows, and the cameras. Wait, hold on. You've been messing with cameras? Spying on your house? He sounded confused. "No, it's not like that," I said quickly. I set them up after a few strange things started happening. You know, creaks, whispers, stuff like that. But now I'm seeing something on the footage. I can't explain it, but it's real. Something is in my house, Mark. There was a pause on the other end. I could practically hear him thinking, weighing his options. "All right. I'll come over tomorrow. We'll check it out together. But you need to stop watching that footage. It's messing with your head." I hung up, feeling both relieved and unsettled. I needed someone else to see it. Someone who could prove I wasn't imagining things. But even as I sat there, waiting for morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was like the very walls of my house were closing in around me, and I was no longer alone. And the worst part? I knew it wasn't over. The dark figure was still out there, waiting for its next move. I didn't sleep a wink that night. My mind was racing, replaying every second of that footage, every flicker of the shadow, every movement of the figure. I sat in my living room, the dim light from my laptop screen casting long shadows across the walls. I didn't dare go to bed. The fear that I wouldn't wake up if I closed my eyes was too much to bear. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that maybe it was just stress. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was in my house. Something had been there for a while, and it was growing more and more brazen. The sound of the front door opening made me snap out of my thoughts. I rushed to the door, expecting to see Mark. It was just past 9 in the morning, and I was relieved to hear the familiar sound of his footsteps on the porch. "Hey, man," he said, his tone light but with an edge of concern in it. "I got your message. You okay?" I didn't know how to answer him. How could I explain what had happened? How could I tell him that I felt like I was losing my mind, like the very air around me was thick with something dark? Instead, I nodded and stepped aside to let him in. "Thanks for coming," I said, my voice tight. "You have no idea how freaked out I am." Mark gave me a reassuring smile, though his eyes betrayed a hint of doubt. He wasn't convinced yet, but I could see that he wanted to help. He wasn't the kind of guy to just dismiss me, not completely. We walked to my study, where I had the footage saved. I had prepared myself to watch it again, but this time I wasn't alone. Mark would see it too, and then we could figure out what was going on. I played the footage for him. At first, he seemed skeptical, watching the first few frames of the hallway camera with casual interest. But as the figure appeared, his expression changed. His eyes narrowed, and he leaned in closer to the screen, watching with the same intensity one had the night before. He trailed off, as if unsure of what to say. "It's not a glitch," I said quickly. "I've watched it 100 times, Mark. It's real. That thing, whatever it is, it's here. It's in my house." Mark didn't respond right away. He was staring at the screen, his brow furrowed. Then, without warning, the figure shifted on the screen, and I saw the same unsettling motion I had before, the unnatural way it twisted and bent, as if its form was a suggestion rather than something solid. "It's moving again," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. He sounded almost afraid. My heart was pounding as I watched the footage with him. This time, I couldn't deny it. It was real. I wasn't imagining things. The figure, so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it, was moving just as I had seen it the night before. Its steps were deliberate, slow, and it seemed to be aware of the camera. It paused, just as it had the first time, its dark form blocking the hallway like a wall of darkness. It was waiting. But then something happened that sent a chill down my spine. The figure suddenly jerked, like something had pulled it out of the frame, or like it had been yanked by an invisible force. In the blink of an eye, it was gone. I turned to Mark. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with disbelief. "What the hell was that?" he muttered under his breath, stepping back from the screen. "That thing, it's not human, is it?" "I don't know," I whispered, my voice shaking. "But it's here, Mark. It's been watching me." Mark looked at the footage again, his eyes scanning every detail, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Have you seen it anywhere else? Around the house?" I nodded, my mind replaying the moment when I had seen it at my bedroom door. I saw it standing outside my room last night. It was right there, just staring at me. I pointed to the screen, where the hallway camera had captured the figure's presence. Mark ran a hand through his hair, looking troubled. "This is insane. We need to get you out of here, man. This place it's not right." But I didn't want to leave. Something deep inside me told me that leaving wasn't the answer. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't going to let me just walk away. If I left, it would follow. It would find me. "I can't leave," I said, my voice steady but filled with a quiet resolve. "I have to figure out what this is. What it wants." Mark didn't argue. He just gave me a long, searching look, then nodded. "All right. But you're not doing this alone. We're going to figure it out together." We spent the rest of the morning reviewing the footage again and again, trying to find any clue that would explain what we were dealing with. But there was nothing. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound, just appeared and disappeared. It was like it was testing us, like it was seeing how far it could push before we cracked. And then, just as I was about to call it a day, we found something new. I rewound the footage to the moment the figure disappeared from the hallway. But this time, I slowed it down, frame by frame. As I did, something caught my eye. In the final frame before the figure vanished, there was a flash of movement, just a brief blur, but it was enough to catch my attention. It was almost like something else had been in the room. Something that was moving with the figure. "What was that?" Mark asked, his voice sharp. "There's something else in that frame." I froze, staring at the screen. He was right. There was something there, just barely visible, a shadow within the shadow. I zoomed in, and that's when I saw it. A pair of eyes. Hollow, black eyes, staring straight at the camera. And then it was gone. The moment I saw those eyes, something inside me broke. I didn't know what I was looking at, but it wasn't human. It was something else, something ancient, something that didn't belong. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears, the sound overwhelming everything else in the room. The air around me had grown thick with an oppressive, choking weight, as if the walls themselves were closing in on us. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. I was trying to keep calm, but it was impossible. The eyes, they weren't just staring at the camera. They were staring at me. Like they could see me, could feel my fear. Mark was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the screen. I could see his mind working, trying to rationalize what we had just witnessed. But there was no rational explanation for what we were seeing. No scientific reasoning. No comforting explanation. Finally, Mark spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "That wasn't a glitch." "No," I said, barely able to keep my voice steady. "That was real. Those eyes, they were looking at us." Mark took a deep breath, his fingers twitching at his sides as if he were trying to find the words to say. But there were no words. No answers. I tried to look away from the screen, but I couldn't. Something kept drawing me back to it, as if the figure, whatever it was calling to me, demanding that I look, that I pay attention. It was as if it knew I was scared, knew I wanted to turn away, and it wouldn't let me. "Maybe we should go back through all the footage," Mark said, trying to regain his composure. "Maybe there's something we missed. Something that can explain all this." But I knew there was nothing more to find. The footage was already clear. It was no longer about what the camera could capture. It was about what was real and what was in my head. But I was wrong. As Mark was fiddling with the laptop, I heard it. A sound. It came from the hallway, just outside the door to the study. The same familiar sound I had been hearing for days now. A faint, rhythmic tapping. A soft shuffling of feet on the floor. It wasn't the wind or the house settling, this was different. This was something alive. My breath hitched in my throat, and I looked at Mark, but he didn't seem to hear it. He was still distracted by the footage, still searching for some explanation. I stood up slowly, my legs trembling beneath me. The sound was getting louder now, closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved toward the door, my hand hesitating just before I touched the handle. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to face what I knew was waiting for me on the other side. But I had to. I had to see. I opened the door just enough to peek into the hallway. The lights in the hallway flickered, casting long, unnatural shadows that danced like they had a mind of their own. I could hear the shuffling sound now, unmistakable. It was coming closer. I stepped into the hallway, my senses on high alert. Every sound, every creak of the floor beneath my feet felt amplified, as if the house itself were alive, watching me. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, standing just beyond the reach of the dim light, was the figure. But it wasn't like before. This time, I could see it clearly. Its shape was more defined, more solid, though it still rippled like smoke, as if it were struggling to maintain a human form. Its outlines seemed to blur and stretch, like something trying to break free from the confines of reality. And those eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, they were there, staring at me, locked onto me as if it could feel my every thought, every fear. I froze. I couldn't move. The air felt thick, suffocating, and I couldn't breathe. It was as if the house had grown smaller, as if the walls were closing in on me. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It simply watched. And then, with a sudden, jerky motion, it shifted. It moved, faster than I could comprehend. In a blink, it was gone, vanishing into the darkness of the hallway. I gasped, stumbling back into the study, my hand shaking violently as I slammed the door shut behind me. Mark looked up from the laptop, his eyes wide with concern. What happened? What did you see? I couldn't speak. I couldn't form the words to describe what I had just witnessed. All I could do was point toward the door, my voice a choked whisper. It was right there. In the hallway. It was there, Mark. Mark stood up, his face pale. You saw it in the flesh? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Are you sure? I nodded, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Yes. It was right there, right in front of me. It was real. I saw it. We stood there for a long moment, the weight of the silence pressing down on us. We both knew, in that instant, that this wasn't just some trick of the mind. Whatever was in this house, it was real. And it wasn't going away. Mark looked at me, his eyes hardening with determination. We need to find out what it is. We need to figure out what it wants. It's not just going to leave on its own. I nodded, my mind racing. But I knew something that Mark didn't. Something deep inside me had shifted. I couldn't fight it anymore. I couldn't run from it. The figure had come for me, and it was going to keep coming. There was only one way to stop it. I had to face it. And I had to do it alone. It was the kind of night that felt too still. The kind of night where the silence pressed in from all sides, and every small sound seemed amplified, like the world was holding its breath. I woke up to the feeling of something strange, something wrong. I lay still for a moment, eyes closed, trying to adjust to the darkness of my bedroom. The quiet hum of the night outside barely reached me. The only sounds I could hear were the usual creaks of the old house, the settling wood, the occasional distant rustle from the trees outside. But then, I felt it. A warm, steady breath against my neck. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was too real, too close. The air was thick with it. Someone, or something, was right next to me, breathing as if they were lying beside me in the bed. My heart raced. I held my breath, hoping it was just a trick of the night, some lingering sensation from a half-remembered dream. I dared not move. Not yet. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I had dreamt it. Maybe it was the house, the creaks and groans that sometimes sounded too human. But this felt too tangible, too real. I shifted my arms slightly, testing the air, my fingers brushing the cold sheets next to me. Empty. The bed was still empty. I was alone. But the breath, it was still there, right next to me, warm and steady. My skin tingled from the proximity, an odd mix of cold sweat and the heavy warmth of the unseen presence beside me. I could feel the tension mounting in my chest. I had to know. Slowly, I turned my head. Nothing. I opened my eyes, the darkness pressing in around me like a thick blanket. There was nothing in the room but shadows and the faint outline of my furniture, indistinct in the lack of light. My eyes darted to the empty space beside me. Still nothing. The breath had stopped, leaving only the silence behind. I sat up, my mind spinning. What had I just felt? I turned the bedside lamp on, the sudden brightness slicing through the darkness. The light flooded the room, casting harsh shadows against the walls. I was alone. But as I looked at the empty bed, a chill ran down my spine. The sheets were undisturbed. Everything was exactly as I had left it before I had fallen asleep. I couldn't explain it. My mind was racing, grasping at any possible explanation. Maybe I had imagined the breath. Maybe the air had just felt warmer for some strange reason. Maybe the heating was malfunctioning again. But the feeling had been so real. So close. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet brushing the cold floor. My body felt heavy, sluggish, like I was moving through water. The room felt smaller somehow, as though the shadows had crept in and were crowding the walls. I needed to check. I needed to be sure I was alone. I stood up and moved toward the door, my eyes scanning the room, searching for anything out of place. The soft carpet beneath my feet seemed to whisper as I moved, the quiet sound amplifying my unease. There was no sign of anyone else. No movement in the corners, no strange noises. Just the ordinary stillness of a room at night. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That someone had been in that bed with me. That someone had been breathing next to me, just out of sight. I glanced back at the bed one last time, my heart still thudding in my chest. But nothing had changed. The sheets were still undisturbed, the room still empty. I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Whatever it was, it had to be in my head, right? A product of my own imagination. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The breath had been real. The presence had been real. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still here. Watching me, waiting. I couldn't get rid of the feeling. It clung to me like a shadow that I couldn't shake off no matter how hard I tried. The warmth of the breath against my neck was still fresh in my mind, like it had just happened, even though the room was silent now. Too silent. I walked around the room, pacing, trying to make sense of it. I checked the windows, locked. I checked the closet, empty. I even checked under the bed, which was absurd, but I had to do it. My mind was spinning, finding any explanation, any rationalization. But nothing made sense. I sat back down on the edge of the bed, trying to breathe, trying to calm myself. The room felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in on me. I rubbed my eyes, willing the panic to subside, but it didn't. It was like a low hum just beneath my thoughts, buzzing louder with every passing second. I couldn't tell if the silence was comforting or suffocating. Every creak in the floorboards, every shift of air in the room felt like a threat, like it was only a matter of time before whatever was in here with me decided to show itself again. I turned the lamp off. The room seemed darker, even though the light from the street outside still filtered through the blinds. The darkness wasn't the same now. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was alive, somehow. It stretched out like a blanket, waiting for something. Something I couldn't quite see, but I felt it lurking in the corners, just out of sight. I heard it then, faint, almost imperceptible, a sound from across the room, behind me. Like the whisper of fabric against skin. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The sound came again. A soft shuffle, like someone shifting their weight, or a breath held too long. It was coming from the corner near the window. That corner. I slowly turned my head, eyes scanning the room. The shadows there were deeper, more concentrated, like they were being pulled toward that one spot. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was there. My body tensed. Every muscle in my legs screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, as if the very air was holding me still. It was only a matter of seconds before I heard it again, closer this time. That same rustling, like someone shifting, maybe sitting up. I whipped my head around, my eyes locked on the corner. My breath quickened, but the room was still. Too still. The shadows were no longer just shadows, they were thicker now, almost like they were moving. I stood up too fast. My legs were weak, unsteady, but I had to check. I had to know if I was really alone. I stumbled toward the corner, my feet hitting the floor with a soft thud echoing in the silence. The room felt colder the closer I got, and the air seemed heavier, like I was walking through thick fog. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched the wall near the corner. The texture of the paint under my fingers was rough, but it felt strange. Wrong. Like it wasn't supposed to feel like that. And then, I heard it. A soft exhale, just behind me. I spun around so fast that I almost lost my balance. Nothing. I blinked into the dark, searching for anything. Any movement. But all I could see was the same empty room. The same stillness. The shadows seemed to be stretching farther now, as if they were trying to pull me in. I was losing it. I had to be. There was no one else here. I had checked. I had checked everything. I walked back to the bed, my heart pounding in my chest. My head was spinning. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the breath, it had been so real. I felt it. I reached for my phone, trying to distract myself. I needed something, anything to ground me back in reality. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the screen, the dim glow of the phone offering some comfort. And then I saw it. A notification. A new message. I hadn't heard my phone buzz, hadn't heard it ding in the background, but there it was, waiting for me. I opened it. The message was simple, only a few words. I'm still here. My breath caught in my throat. I looked around the room again, my heart pounding harder, my thoughts racing. There was no way. There was no one else here. I was alone. But somehow, I felt more trapped now, more exposed than I had ever felt before. I had to find out. I had to know who was in my house. I was frozen. My hand still gripped my phone, but it felt like an anchor now, heavy, useless. I'm still here. The words echoed in my head, louder than any sound I'd heard in the room. I could feel the blood drain from my face. My stomach twisted, a knot of fear that I couldn't untangle. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, but the air felt thick, suffocating, as if I was drowning in it. I glanced around the room again. There was no one. No one except for me. But something wasn't right. I needed to move. I needed to do something. I couldn't stay here, not with that message hanging in the air, not with the feeling of a presence I couldn't see. I stood up too quickly, my legs wobbling beneath me. The floor creaked under my weight. It wasn't just the sound of the floorboards. It was the way the sound lingered, like it was swallowed by something else in the room, something watching, waiting. I turned towards the door, my thoughts scattered. I couldn't stay in here. I couldn't stay in this room where I had felt the breath, where I had seen the shadows move. But the door felt so far away. Every step I took felt like it took longer than the last, as if the space between me and the exit was stretching, becoming endless. And then, I heard it again. A soft rustling sound, like the shifting of fabric. But this time, it was closer. Much closer. My heart stopped. I froze, not daring to turn around. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, prickling with the sensation of being watched. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier, and it felt as though something was just behind me, hovering, too close for comfort. I held my breath, waiting for the sound to come again. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, there it was. A whisper. Barely audible, but unmistakable. It came from right behind me. I'm here. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My body was locked in place, my mind screaming at me to move, to get away, to do something, but all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by fear. My phone buzzed again. This time, the message was different. You won't leave. The words sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I had to get out. There was no time to waste. But my legs were trembling now, and it felt like the room was pressing on me from all sides, suffocating me. I could barely breathe, the air thick and oppressive. My pulse was hammering in my ears as I stumbled toward the door. 1 step. 2. But then, I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like something shifting, something large moving slowly behind me. I spun around, my breath coming in sharp, panic gasps. Nothing. The room was empty. But the feeling, it didn't go away. The weight in the air, the oppressive stillness that hung like a thick fog, none of it felt right. My heart raced in my chest as I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining it. That it was all in my head. But that voice, the whisper, had been so real. It had been so close. I backed away from the door, my phone clutched in my trembling hand. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight, constricted. I couldn't let myself break down. I needed to think. I needed to make sense of this. I turned toward the window, eyes scanning the dimly lit street outside. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the distant hum of the city. But there, in the reflection of the glass, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. A figure, standing in the corner of the room. My breath hitched in my throat. My mind tried to rationalize it. My reflection was distorting things. But no! I knew what I saw. I wasn't imagining it. The figure wasn't a shadow. It was solid. I jerked my head around to look. Nothing. The corner was empty. I felt a chill run down my spine. I rushed to the window, fumbling with the lock as panic surged through me. I had to get out. I had to escape, but the window wouldn't open. It stuck, resisting my frantic tugging. I slammed my fist against it, desperate. And that's when I felt it again, the cold breath, the heat of it against my neck, like someone was standing right behind me, close enough to touch. I spun around, but there was nothing. Just empty space. My mind was unraveling. I couldn't trust what I was seeing. I couldn't trust myself. And then, in the stillness of the room, I heard it once more, closer this time, almost in my ear. I'm right here. I turned quickly, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing. Nothing but the deafening silence that now filled the room. I had no idea how long I stood there, my back pressed against the cold glass of the window, hands trembling, mind racing. My thoughts were a chaotic mess. Half of me wanted to run, the other half wanted to curl up and pretend none of this was happening. But it didn't matter. I knew there was no escaping whatever this was. I glanced around again, my eyes desperately scanning the room. The quiet was suffocating now. Too quiet. The usual hum of the apartment, the distant sounds of traffic, all of it was gone. I could feel the silence pressing down on me, suffocating me, like the air had thickened and was no longer breathable. And still, nothing. But the weight of the presence was undeniable. It was there, lingering just out of sight. The sensation was too real to ignore. My pulse was thumping in my ears, the rhythm chaotic, like it was trying to escape my body. The whispering voice, that voice still rang in my mind. I'm right here. I shook my head, forcing myself to breathe, forcing myself to focus. This couldn't be real. It just couldn't be. And yet, everything in my body screamed that it was. The warmth of breath on the back of my neck, the feeling of someone or something right behind me, it was all too vivid. Too tangible. The dread twisted in my stomach like a knot that wouldn't loosen. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to leave. I needed to go somewhere, anywhere, that felt safe. My phone was still clutched tightly in my hand, but it didn't feel like a lifeline anymore. In fact, it felt almost useless. What was I supposed to do? Who could I even call? I turned away from the window, my legs still shaky beneath me. There had to be a way out. The door. I needed to get to the door, to leave the apartment and find someone, find safety. But the door, something about it felt wrong. I could see the dim outline of it across the room, but it felt like miles away. Every step towards it felt like it took longer than the last. I took a slow, careful step forward. then another. The air felt colder with each movement, the silence growing more suffocating. And then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a footstep. Soft, but deliberate. Like someone walking slowly behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing. Only the empty room. My heart skipped a beat, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I was losing my mind. I turned back toward the door. I had to keep moving. I could still make it out of here. I took a few more steps, my breath coming faster now, panic creeping into every movement. Every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet was amplified in the stillness of the room. And then another step. But this time it was louder. Closer. I froze. This time it wasn't my imagination. This time the sound was real. I couldn't make myself turn around. My legs were stiff, locked in place by fear. The floorboards creaked again, this time not behind me, but right beside me. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was suffocating. My eyes darted toward the door again, but it still seemed impossibly far away. The seconds stretched on, each one longer than the last. And then, softly, so softly I almost didn't catch it at first, I heard it. A whisper. I'm here. It was right next to me. I could feel the heat of it against my ear, the breath almost brushing my skin. But when I turned, when I looked, nothing. Just empty air. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. I had to get out. There was no other option now. I bolted for the door, my hand grasping the handle, fingers slick with sweat. I yanked it open, but the hallway outside was dark. Too dark. The apartment building had always had dim lighting, but this was different. The shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should have. They reached for me, pulling me toward them like hands made of darkness. I hesitated for a split second. Should I leave? Was there something out there waiting for me? No. I had to leave. I took one step out of the apartment. And then, before I could move another inch, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. I spun around, my heart racing in my chest. But the hallway was still empty. I looked down at my phone again, desperate to do something, anything, to make sense of this. But it was gone. Completely dead. I tried pressing buttons, shaking it, but it wouldn't turn on. It was like it had just vanished. I heard a faint, familiar sound. A soft rustling, like fabric. It came from just beyond the corner of the hallway. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I stepped forward, my feet barely making a sound against the carpet. Every instinct screamed for me to turn back, but I couldn't. I couldn't let whatever this was, whatever was following me, win. And then, I saw it. A figure. Just a shadow, standing at the far end of the hall. It was tall, too tall. Its features were obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its presence, like it was stretching out toward me. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I was paralyzed. The figure stepped forward, slowly. One step, then another. And I could hear it now. The soft, rasping breath. I'm here. The words were unmistakable. But this time, they didn't come from the figure. They came from right beside me. I snapped my head to the side, and there, standing just inches from me, was the stranger. Its face, what I could see of it, was barely human. Its skin was pale, sickly, stretched too tight over its skull. Its eyes were black, endless, reflecting nothing but darkness. I opened my mouth to scream, but the sound never came. I couldn't move. I was frozen, my legs like stone, my throat tight as if it were being squeezed by invisible hands. The figure, the stranger, was right there, so close I could feel the oppressive weight of its presence, as if the air itself had become thick with it. Its eyes, those dark, endless pits of nothingness, were staring into mine. I couldn't look away. They held me in place, like I was being pulled deeper into them, as if they could swallow me whole. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, anything, but nothing came. My breath was shallow, ragged. I could hear it in my ears, the sound of my own heart hammering in my chest, like it was trying to escape my body. But the figure stood silent. It didn't move. It just watched. Then, the voice. That soft, rasping voice. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was closer, almost intimate. "I'm here." The words echoed through the silence of the hallway, reverberating in my head like a sick joke. I was so close to panicking, to losing control completely, but something inside me refused to break. I couldn't let it. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as though the floor had turned to quicksand beneath me, pulling me down with every attempt to escape. The walls seemed to close in, shrinking around me. And then, the figure moved. It was so fast, too fast. 1 second it was standing there, looming in the shadows, and the next it was right in front of me. Its face, what I could see of it, was even worse up close. Its skin was stretched, pale and sickly, as if it had been pulled too tight. There were no features, no definition, just a void where a face should have been. A mouth open wide, impossibly wide, as if to devour me whole. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. My hands fled out, desperate for something to grab onto, but there was nothing. The hallway was still as empty as ever, save for the figure that now seemed to be everywhere, its presence surrounding me, suffocating me. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. Vanished. I blinked, my vision swimming, my head spinning. I felt dizzy, disoriented, like the floor beneath me had been ripped away. My breaths came in ragged gasps, and I had to fight to keep from collapsing to the ground. My mind raced. What had just happened? Was it real? Had I imagined it? I didn't know. I could feel my pulse thrumming in my ears, still echoing with the sound of that voice. "I'm here." Over and over again, the words repeating in my head, a loop I couldn't escape. But the hallway was empty now. The figure was gone. The silence had returned, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, heavy, like the air was thick with something unseen, something waiting. I had to leave. I had to get out of there, away from whatever was happening. I turned to run, but my legs felt like lead, like I was moving through water. The door to the apartment was still in front of me, but it felt miles away. Every step I took seemed to stretch longer, like the distance between me and safety was infinite. I reached the door, my hand shaking as I grabbed the handle, but when I tried to turn it, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. I tried again, panic setting in. I yanked on the handle, twisting it with all my strength, but it didn't move. I could feel the cold metal pressing against my skin, but it wasn't opening. I was trapped. A sound behind me made me freeze. It was a soft, steady breathing. I slowly turned around, every instinct screaming at me not to. But I had no choice. I had to know. The hallway was still empty. There was no figure, no shadow. But the air felt different now. Charged, thick with something I couldn't name. The breathing was louder now, coming from right behind me. I didn't turn. I couldn't. I could feel the warmth of it on my neck, like hot breath against my skin. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, every inch of my body screaming at me to run, to get away, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if I were stuck in place, rooted to the floor, unable to escape. Then came the voice again, that same raspy whisper, this time louder, clearer. "I'm right behind you." I swallowed hard, the words reverberating in my chest, choking me. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The fear, the terror, was a living thing, crawling beneath my skin, wrapping itself around my ribs, squeezing tighter with every breath. I had to get out. I had to move. I turned back to the door, my hand flying to the handle again, desperation clawing at my throat. This time, it opened. I shoved it open and stumbled out into the darkness of the hallway. The door slammed shut behind me, and I didn't dare look back. I ran. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get away from the apartment, away from whatever was following me. My breath came in jagged gasps, my mind consumed by the need to escape. I ran down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls, but the further I went, the more the world around me seemed to warp. The hallway stretched on forever, the walls closing in, the ceiling lowering. It felt like I was moving through a maze that had no end. The light above flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move with me. My eyes darted around, but I couldn't see anything beyond the darkness, the shadows, the shifting shapes that seemed to breathe with me. And then I heard it. The footsteps. Not behind me, not in front of me, but beside me. They were keeping pace with me, matching my every move. I couldn't stop. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.